Okay. And we're live. Hello everyone. Welcome to the Gravity Max live stream. Today we are going to be talking about the history of Russia, of the U.S.S.R. in Russia. So it's a time period from about 1917 up until 1991. So let's get right into it. Today we have our friend Zach here. So that's fun.
Yeah.
Say hi, Zach.
Hey, guys.
How's it going, Zach?
And I'm here as always.
Yep.
And we got a fun one for you guys today.
Yeah.
Where is Russia? What was the Soviet Union?
Mm-hmm.
Why is communism bad?
These are all questions.
All will be answered today.
Yep.
On the Gravity Max live stream.
Yep. So hopefully you guys are tuning in. I hope we get a lot of viewers this time because everyone's stuck in their house. Like, what else are you going to be doing, you know?
Right.
Other than watching the Gravity Max live stream. You have no excuse not to. Anyways, as always, we have our live chat open, and I have my social media desk next to me, so I can respond to your comments if you have any. So make sure to leave those in the chat. So yeah, we're going to have a fun episode. So yeah, let's begin. This video is not intended for children under 13 years old. If you are under 13 years old, please do not watch this video, as the topics we discuss are meant for those with at least a high school level of education. If you are not 13, you will not understand the scientific topics discussed in this video. So this video is more historical than scientific, but we definitely have some scientific themes here. We're just branching out a little bit. And it's a really interesting history, but regardless, if you are 13, you're not old enough. This history is, it's gruesome. It involves war and death. So.
This is an elitist channel.
Yeah, it's
only
not
13 plus.
Yeah, this
allowed.
is the history of the U.S.S.R. is PG-13. So if you're not 13, then you can't watch it. Okay. Visit the Gravity Max website. It's a Google Sites website, but Google Sites websites can be very nice if you do them properly. So go visit it. Also, follow Gravity Max on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Links to everything in the description. Yeah, you should visit the social media pages. They offer reminders for the live streams and for the videos on Wednesdays. And yeah, that's it. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So follow Sebastian on social media and check out his YouTube channel, 128 Seconds, where he explains topics in 128 seconds. So the videos, I think, this is probably the last one, right? This week that you're going to put on.
Yeah, this week. That's going to be on this.
The final 128 seconds?
Yep. Well, not the final. The final 128 seconds on this channel, yeah. They're all going to be moved to his channel at the end of March. So make sure that you subscribe, okay? So, yeah. All right. So then, A Truly Dead Rock. Great book, if I do say so myself. Yeah.
And I do.
And I do. It's a science fiction novel, and I wrote it, and I published it in Thanksgiving last year. And I'm already on 200 pages of the next one, and I'm pretty sure I'll be finished with a first complete draft by the end of March, because we have been, not quarantined, but my school is currently on break for a week, but then they were like, okay, we gotta extend break by another week because we cannot come back in these conditions. So because of that reason, I'll probably be able to finish a first draft of this book. So yeah, that'll be cool. So get ready for the second one, which will be on November 1st next year. That's what I've decided. Okay. Anyways, history of the U.S.S.R. So today, this is a fun topic that we are going to discuss: the history of the U.S.S.R. So yeah. you all know about Russia, right? You've heard of Russia before, and it's the largest nation in the world, but it used to be even bigger. And this is the story of the USSR.
Of the U.S.S.R.
Yeah.
I love the musical cues.
Right? The music's great.
Yeah.
I'm like,
so
this is
the
perfect.
USSR and Russia, it's
Mm-hmm.
very interesting because Russia has been in the seat of being a global star
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of times, and it's like on and off with it like a lot throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the U.S., it was just it wasn't, and then it was, you know, and it still is. With China, it's kind of the same way. It wasn't, and now it is. But with Russia, it fluctuated way more than the other countries I just listed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, so that's what makes its history so rich, and that's why we have it here for you guys today, because it talks a lot. It speaks to the issues of like politics, of revolutions, of bad leadership, and even like geographical stuff.
Yeah.
And even some scientific.
You could say that the USSR peaked in terms of Russia's like political significance globally, because when the USSR was competing with America in the Cold War, it was pretty much the second highest on the leaderboard, essentially, of global powers after World War II, especially.
Yeah,
so
I would agree with that, actually. I would say that the USSR was, like, for the time, and when you, like, adjust for, like, inflation, as well as, like, the fact that, like, the 1960s versus 2020, I feel like that was, like, Russia at its, like, strongest.
Yeah, so Russia, leading up into the period of the USSR, so Russia has always been kind of this oddball in Europe. So it's at the very east of Europe, but a lot of, Siberia, that all stretches into Asia. So it doesn't exactly align with European culture, nor does it align with Asian culture. So it's kind of its own thing. And so leading up to the creation of the USSR, Russia was behind in industrialization, like compared to European powers. So they like tried to push forwards, and they've been working like during this period in the early 1900s. They're trying to become a major power. So the fact that the USSR actually did succeed in making Russia the second superpower in the world is pretty major, because they were trying to do this for a while, and this is how they succeeded. So all right. Should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, let's go into the Russian Revolution.
All right. So the Russian Revolution.
The musical.
Yep. The Russian Revolution between 1917 and 1923. This was when Russia went from a monarchy to a like communist authoritarian government. So we'll get into this in like slides in this section, but Russia used to be led by a Tsar, right? Up until, I think it was 1918 he abdicated, but we'll get to that. So Russia, it was a monarchy like Britain or France was, right? And the monarchies at this point, most of them had been either just completely discontinued, like France, the French monarchy was killed during the 1790s, right? Or the monarchies have been greatly checked with constitutions like in Britain. So the fact that Russia was still a monarchy up until like 1917 was pretty major. So monarchy, that's like the key thing here, right? So there were a lot of peasants and poor people in Russia because of this system with the monarchy and the Tsar. And they were very unhappy, There was industrialization, but all that did was led to poor working conditions and, the hallmarks of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, right? So eventually
I'm just looking at statistics now. And in 1917, 80% of Russia's population were peasants.
Wow.
Yeah.
Depending on labor for very.
Yeah, so essentially it was bound to happen that the Tsar would have been overthrown just because he was not being a good leader. He was a pretty bad leader, the last
80%
Tsar.
poverty.
And most of the people that farmed didn't even own the land that they farmed on, which contrasts with like America and other areas that were heavily agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
another interesting thing about the Russian Revolution is how many like retellings there are of it. There's a really good movie called Dr. Zhivago, which tells the story of the Russian Revolution, and it is also, because it's like more recent than the American and French revolutions, it has a lot of significance in pop culture, and there are a lot of songs that described it that were made like in the 1950s. It's something that the USSR would reminisce about during its entire existence, pretty much.
Interesting.
I would like to address.
Chat.
Quick.
Yeah, sure. We have Lucia Schneering, do Mr. Miller justice.
Yeah, Mr. Miller was our me and Lucia's seventh grade history teacher, or social studies teacher is what they call it then.
Yeah.
And we're gonna do him justice. We're gonna go just so into Russia, into the USSR. We will document every single fact. We will look at every single detail, and we will form this network of information that will all suffice to explain the history of the
Yeah.
So we will not only do Mr. but the USSR.
Yeah, so the Russian Revolution, it's a very interesting period of time because it almost created a democratic government. There was a period during this revolution. So the revolution was fairly chaotic, but there was like a 6-month period where there was a, democratic like parliament type deal called the Duma, and they were in power, but then they were quickly overthrown by these communist forces. So let's get into it. Yeah, so I'm going to go to the next slide, unless you have anything else to say. Cool. Okay.
It all starts
it all starts here.
And you can check out my video about World War I, where I explain World War I in under 100.
Nice.
This is also the thumbnail, that video.
Oh.
And right here we have Russia.
Yeah.
In red, because that's what we're talking.
Oh gosh.
But
my computer's being laggy for some reason. Anyways, yeah, I finally got to the slide. I had to click like 5 times. Anyways, yeah. So continue. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say it's on you now. I was just explaining how you can check out my video, my channel. 120.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Let's see. Yeah, Lucia says again he'd be proud, so that's nice.
Oh yeah.
So Russia fought with the Allied powers in World War I, obviously.
Yeah.
And it's basically team red, white, and blue versus everyone else.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
I didn't notice until they were all on the slide.
Yep. Yeah, so Russia fought with the Allied powers, and they composed most of the Eastern Front, which was, Russia versus Germany and Russia versus Austria-Hungary. So this is interesting because the French, British, and eventually Americans, they all fought on the Western Front, which was the border between France and Germany. So the Eastern Front was a little different, and Russia ended up having to withdraw from the war by 1917. So what was going on was the Tsar, he did not appoint a good military leader. That's part of it, but at the same time, Russia was also kind of unprepared. So it was both the fault of bad leadership and just not being prepared to fight against Germany.
Yeah, we're going to get more into the poor leadership.
Yeah, but basically
who was in that cabinet, because there's some choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
But keep going.
yeah. So at this point in time, Germany was actually like the main power in Europe militarily. There was the German unification, and they became very powerful because they had a lot of industrialization and a lot of military might. So they were really a force to be reckoned with, right? And even with two fronts, like the Allies, could have lost this war, right? It wasn't like decided from the outset. But anyways, so in Russia, right, there were Tsar Nicholas appointed a bad leader, and Russia was not doing well in the war. So this caused people to become unhappy with the situation back in Russia because they're like, "You're failing us, right?" So the Tsar ended up being like, "Okay, you're trash. I'm gonna do this myself." He pulls a Thanos. Fine, I'll do it myself.
Yeah.
And so he actually like goes away from the main palace, and he actually takes on leading the military, and he does not do well either, just because they can't really handle it, right? So in 1917, when the revolution begins, Russia has to withdraw from the war. That's what happened in World War One. Russia actually just stopped. They're like, okay, we just can't keep fighting. We're not going to win. So even though the Allies were victorious, Russia had to drop out about halfway through. And in a lot of ways, World War One is what caused the Russian Revolution because it put a lot of strain on Russia. A lot of resources that could have been used to help the peasants or something, or just enrich the economy in general, those were put towards fighting in the war. And this is a concept called total warfare, which was seen in World War One on pretty much every nation: Germany, Britain, France, where everything a nation has got is put into the war effort. So you start rationing food because they're like, we got to save that food for the soldiers, and in a lot of cases, people were happy to do it because they had a lot of nationalistic pride. So it was a very different time period when it comes to war because most of the nations were in agreement. There were a few people within a nation that were like, no, this is bad. But generally, people supported war, which is very different from today, where I would say the majority of citizens in the U.S. are probably opposed to war. Yeah. So if the U.S. were to start a war with some nation, the majority would be against it rather than for it, which is interesting. So Russia, World War One depleted Russia's resources and brought it dishonor and disgrace from just not being equipped to
having to pull out of a war. Is
and
taboo.
To make it worse, Russia originally was arguably the person that escalated the conflict in World War One. They were the one that decided to get involved in the affairs because of their close
to Serbia's
because of their close relation to Slavs.
And
they couldn't finish the war because everyone had a different idea of how the war would end up being played out.
Yeah, they couldn't protect Serbia like they wanted to. Serbia did not. Serbia kind of got messed up.
The war just ended up dragging on
a
lot, and it became pretty brutal in the final years. And Russia leaving was one of the main reasons why the U.S. would eventually decide to get involved.
Yeah.
Or it would influence how much the U.S. would get involved.
Yeah.
Definitely. So definitely it was very impactful that Russia left the but looking at it from inside the nation, from that perspective, from inside Russia, it was just not a time. The citizens were not vibing when they pulled out of the war because, like you said, they were very nationalistic, one of the most nationalistic countries at the time. Them pulling out of the war, okay. They were looking at the leaders of Russia at that time, and after they pulled out, they were like, okay, what are our leaders doing? And there was already a lot of dissent, and we're going to talk about that more on the next slide. There was a lot of dissent against the leader of Russia and his entire cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
and this was like another key factor into why he eventually.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
What?
Interesting.
We gotta see.
So should we go to the next slide? Or yeah, keep going.
Yeah, let's move on to Tsar Nicholas II.
Cool.
That's the Russian word for Tsar, which literally means just
king.
So King Nicholas II.
It has like 4 spellings in English, so we're just gonna go with the Russian. You know?
Yeah. So he's rocking the legendary stash and beard. Love that combo.
Yep.
Unfortunately, none of the Russian people did, and none of the Russian people loved him because he was seen by the Russian people as being kind of like a weak leader. That might have also have started because of Nicholas I. Like I can't remember specifically, but I can't remember if Nicholas I.
I think he didn't live up to Nicholas I.
Yeah, he didn't live up to.
And the people that he surrounded himself with were also seen as like crazy and weak.
Yeah, no, his council of ministers, which is effectively his cabinet, lots of them had no business.
Yeah, they were highly questionable, especially Rasputin.
Yep.
Yeah, Rasputin was just a choice character. So Rasputin was he was known as the Mad Monk, for anyone that doesn't know, if you haven't heard the song.
Yep. Rah,
Rasputin. Yeah. But he was this crazy party animal guy, right? And everyone thought he had mystical powers. And what he did was he saved Tsar Nicholas' son, Alexei, because Alexei had a disease, hemophilia, where he would not stop bleeding if he got cut. So, they didn't know how to help him after he got banged up, and Rasputin comes in and heals him somehow. We still don't know how he did that.
I think it was just luck. Yeah. I think it was the Tsarina. So the queen called Rasputin and was like, "Oh my gosh, he's so sick." And then Rasputin's like, "He'll be better tomorrow." And then he was just better tomorrow, just by luck, I think, just by chance.
And then they just trusted everything
exactly.
to him.
Yeah.
That's like
then
rolling
became
a
the family.
20, it's like.
And people did not like that he got so much power, so they tried to assassinate him. They were originally unsuccessful, but then they finally got him.
Yeah,
he got shot, stabbed, poisoned, drowned, and he kind of survived all of them.
Yeah, he was a total tank. He survived probably, I would say, 3 assassination attempts that should have killed him. But then another one ended up actually getting him. But it's interesting.
So his cabinet, there were people in there that were legitimately clinically insane. I think his minister of war or something had schizophrenia, or was suffering from hallucinations, and Tsar Nicholas was it'll be great. But that shows, and that's reflected across his cabinet. There were people that just did not know how to do their job. Were not just fit to do anything, the crazy guy. Yeah. And it was basically, people ended up seeing this as his reign went on. People noticed that the people that were in the government weren't doing their job, and we said earlier, there was 80% of Russia was peasants.
Yeah.
People. And eventually that descent turned into revolution, which is what we're going to...
Yeah, so, Tsar Nicholas, it's just, it's not a good time. It's interesting because he was just, his family, they were not very much in the public eye as much as they should have been. They were fairly reclusive, and that is partially because of his son's sickness, which hemophilia is actually treatable today. I don't think it's not curable, but it's not, I mean, it's a major disease, but it's people in developed countries don't die from it as often as like in the past.
Oh wait, that's so interesting.
Yeah, they just had no idea.
Hold on, look at this.
Yeah.
No.
Oh.
No. Look at this.
Yeah.
Tsar Nicholas II. He actually abdicated in 1918. Guess what day?
What day?
Today, March 15th.
Oh.
1917. He abdicated.
Wow, that's the tie-in. Yeah, I think. But yeah, Tsar Nicholas, he had been bad for a while. It wasn't just World War II that started it. In 1905, there was the Bloody Sunday Massacre, where there were people that were working in like new factories, just like recent from industrialization, and they were protesting work conditions. And then the Tsar's troops ended up like killing them, even though they were just peacefully protesting. So that was not good. That made him fairly unpopular. And because of that event, I think that's why he had to create the Duma, which was kind of like, it was very weak. It was supposed to check his power, but he did not like listen to it very often, and he often like denied its requests. So this is kind of like how the British Parliament started. At first, when the British Parliament was created, like it didn't have as much power over the monarch as it does now. Like now it's really just the British Parliament and the monarch has no power. But Tsar Nicholas, he essentially instituted this, like the Duma, to be like, look, I'm democratizing, like I'm giving you a voice, but then he wouldn't listen to them. So that festered a little as well. And once he abdicates, the Duma takes power for a while. So, yeah. Yeah, should I go to the next slide?
How would you guys rate that stat?
I would say...
Well, I mean, I need more content. What would be an example of a one stash?
Yeah.
Like,
one
is
stash?
the Mario stash a one stash?
No, let's go, Hitler's mustache is a 1. Because
God.
it's not fashionable.
Okay.
Maybe it would be fashionable if Hitler didn't exist, though.
I'm pretty sure...
No, it still looks pretty bad. It's just
actually, never mind. It looks pretty bad.
It's a square.
I'm pretty sure it was fashionable at the time, and then it became unpopular.
Yeah, it looks like it's just a strip of Velcro under your nose.
Yeah, it does look pretty bad.
Come on, man.
No, that's true. But a lot of people actually did like have that at the time, but then they quickly stopped because they were like,
I think the beard of Tsar Nicholas is probably like a solid 8, 7.5. But I don't like the combo. The combo is like a little.
You don't
too
like
much.
the combo?
It's a little too dense for me, you know. Like one or the other. That's my personal opinion.
I like the combo personally. I think it works. He makes it work.
What do you
think, Max?
I think it works. I think it works, definitely.
Yeah.
I think they're like the appropriate styles together, you know? Yeah. Anyway.
I want to see Tsar Nicholas without his mustache and see how cursed that looks.
No, okay. Next slide. I'm going to the next slide. No, thank you. Okay. So,
with the Duma, though, like, what happened was they tried to expand the voting power of the average person, and then eventually the voting power led to people like putting a bunch of socialists into the Duma, and then the original members of the Duma that weren't socialists decided to kick all of the socialists out, and that sort of like sparked people to want to start to overthrow the government.
Interesting. So, so this is the February Revolution. And so this was an interesting revolution, especially just because of its name. So it occurred in March of 1917. And the reason for that was that Russia was still on the Julian calendar, whereas like most of the world had switched to the Gregorian calendar. So their calendar was like 16 days behind, I think, yeah. So they were still in February when this happened, even though it technically occurred in March. So it's still called the February Revolution, even though that's like, oh, it's so infuriating, right? Don't you think?
Yeah.
This is also another revolution. The next one, the October Revolution, occurred in November, and I'm just there like, why? Why have you done this, history? But yeah, so the February Revolution is where they originally overthrew Tsar Nicholas. And so this was more moderate, I would say. So this was, they put the Duma in power, and they had the Tsar just like abdicate. And I wouldn't call it peaceful, but compared to what happens next, you could see it as a fairly peaceful change of power. I mean, there was still violence, but the Tsar wasn't
No,
killed.
I would disagree. I don't think
Really?
it's. I don't think it's a very peaceful change
Well, no,
of power because of the war that it sparked.
Okay,
But
well, what it sparked.
I think
but...
maybe you're right. Initially, it was it was a pretty straightforward takeover, except the aftermath of it was like the Russian Civil War was definitely not.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm talking about. The Russian Civil War after. I just mean this particularly. If like things were able to calm down, if the Duma had been able to keep things under control, this would be a fairly like minor like as a revolution. It wouldn't be known for so much violence, but basically like the Tsar stepped down instead of having to be killed, which he eventually ended up killed in the later parts of the revolution, he and his family. But during the February Revolution, they didn't actually kill the Tsar, which is interesting because if you look at the French Revolution, one of the first things they did, like once they took power, they killed the King Louis, right? That was his name.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah. So that's interesting. So basically the key points of the February Revolution is that it got rid of the monarchy and it instituted the Duma, and that was supposed to be representative. But there were some problems with the Duma, like that it was very elitist, so it wasn't actually representative of the people. So it kind of was like, how would you describe it? I wouldn't quite say oligarchy, right? Or is that a good description?
I mean,
the one that replaced the Tsar?
Yeah, the Duma. They were supposed to represent the people, but they kind of represented the rich of Russia. So
yeah, they were kind of aristocratic.
Yeah, like that
in a way.
Yeah.
So it was
is why
specifically
people started boycotting the elections.
Mm.
Yeah, specifically they're called the Russian Provisional Government. That name of like it was the Duma and whoever else took power, or maybe that is the Duma as well. And I guess like there isn't really a name for what they were because it was kind of not rushed, but none of them like expected to have to come into power because the revolution, the February Revolution was like sparked by riots and like strikes over the scarcity of food, and that happened in Petrograd, which is now known as St. Petersburg.
Okay.
And yeah, so it was kind of abrupt.
Yeah. That city specifically is pretty important for the entire history of the U.S.S.R. because it started out as Petrograd, but then wouldn't they eventually rename it to Leningrad? And then
I think.
And then they changed it back to St. Petersburg.
Yeah, Leningrad.
That was its original name, so.
I didn't know they were the same place. Oh, wow. I'm just now realizing that.
Another interesting thing that I just found out is the reason the February Revolution is called the February Revolution was because for Russians, it actually did happen in February.
Yeah, that's what it
They
is.
used a different calendar than other countries until 1918.
Yeah.
So
I have a question.
It's like really strange that they're off by a few days.
Yeah.
So what city did they rename to Stalingrad?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Oh yeah, I feel like they
Stalingrad is
Moscow.
Okay, that's what I thought.
No, they renamed it to Volgograd.
Wait, what? Okay, I'm confused now.
Moscow was always Moscow.
Okay.
Cool. It's Volgograd now.
Is Volgo a person or is it just...
Who is Volgo?
Who is Volgo? No, well,
Volgo, I have no idea.
Well, it's interesting.
What if we translated that?
We'll get into this later, but what started as like a revolution about sort of, class
It's the river.
Okay.
The river.
Okay, that makes sense. So what started out as a revolution about class and like people being impoverished ended up like forming a government with these like cults of personality. So they renamed cities after their leaders. So Leningrad, Stalingrad. Grad means like it's kind of like Opolis, so it means city of, right? So like city of Stalin, city of Lenin. Yeah, like think if like we just think if like the president, when the president came into power, they just renamed Washington D.C. to like Trumpopolis, right? Like, wouldn't that be interesting?
That would not go well.
Exactly, right. Or like Obamopolis, like every single time there's a new president, they just rename it. So yeah, the major leaders so Lenin and Stalin, they ended up having cities named after them. So that's interesting. That's an interesting aspect here. So yeah, should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. Okay, so now we have the Bolshevik Revolution, also known as the October Revolution. And again, this is the same calendar problem. It actually took place in November, and both of these were in 1917. So the Bolsheviks it was a political party, right? And it was headed by Lenin. So Lenin led the Bolsheviks, and what ended up happening was they overthrew the Duma, and I think it was called like a bloodless coup. I mean, what happened after, of course, then you ended up with civil war. But the Duma, when the Bolsheviks came to the Duma and were like get out of here, right? They just kind of went. They weren't like the strong, stubborn leader that's gonna hold on to their power no matter what. They're just like, okay, yeah, we don't know what we're doing. So they weren't very strong leaders either. So the Tsar was bad. He was a weak leader, but so was the Duma for these first 6 months. And so since they were not able to pull Russia out of its bad situation, that's why the Bolsheviks ended up taking power. So that's interesting because it's like when it's that like in bad situations, dictatorships or monarchies tend to be more stable than democratic governments. Because you see the authoritarianism of the U.S.S.R. that lasted like 80 years, and the Tsar had been in power for hundreds of years, like the dynasty. So it's interesting because democracies thrive when things are going well, generally. Because this was such an untenable situation that the Duma really couldn't fix, that gave the opportunity to Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks to have like a charismatic leader that like takes over. So that's kind of why that happened. Yeah.
Yeah. So, from what I remember from history class, Lenin got like exiled under the reign of Tsar Nicholas because like he was a prominent like figure like in politics, I think, or at least he was like I don't know what the words that come into me, but he had very strong opinions on the government.
Well, he was Marxist.
He was a candidate, I think.
Yeah.
Or at least he was supported heavily by the Socialist Party, and he had pretty radical beliefs.
Yeah.
But not to the majority of people, because more than 80% of the population, like you said before, were peasants, and the rest probably were not extremely wealthy.
Yeah, so he got exiled to Siberia, but after Nicholas abdicated, he was able to like come back. He was able to like sneak back in, I guess.
Yeah.
And then he becomes prominent again, and he becomes the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
He also like there was assassination attempts on his life too that he narrowly escaped.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, the problem here, right, is that the Duma was located, at the capital, and Russia is such a big country. So even once the Bolsheviks, took over the capital and they, replaced the Duma, there were people very far away, like hundreds or even thousands of miles away, just because of how large Russia is, that they were not pleased with the change of authority. They preferred the Duma. And so this is what ended up sparking the Civil War, because the Bolsheviks, they were fairly radical. Obviously, they were a radical group, socialism. And so some people in Russia, they advocated for reform. They advocated for democracy and the Duma, but they didn't go as far as to say that they should start having a socialist system. So that's interesting, because there were some people that were like, okay, the monarch is bad, it's not a good way to lead, but they didn't want to have a socialist government either. And so you see these people actually uniting with people that are actually loyal to the original Tsar, and they form this group to fight against the Bolsheviks. And so you end up with two armies, and this is going to get into the Civil War. You have the Red Army and the White Army. So let's see. Should we get into that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So next slide. So the Russian Civil War. You can see from the two flags, there's the Red Army and the White Army. So the Red Army was the Bolsheviks, and they had a lot of conviction. They were very dedicated to their cause, whereas the White Army was fairly disparate, because you had some loyalists, you had some moderates, and then you even had religious figures, because the government of the U.S.S.R. under the Bolsheviks ended up being it was an atheist government, because they didn't want the people to worship a god, like the god was supposed to be the leader. You see that in a lot of countries today, like in North Korea, where the leader is hailed as some sort of god, right? So yeah, so religious figures, loyalists to the Tsar, and finally just moderates that didn't want to go this far, they ended up fighting against the Bolsheviks. But because they were so disparate and it wasn't sure what would happen if they won, it just did not work out. They didn't have enough conviction to win this fight. So the Bolsheviks ended up winning. And I'm not sure, but were the Bolsheviks outnumbered? I think they may have been, but they were just
I think officially they could have been, but they had, just based on population and based on volunteers, they probably had more people that were willing to join the fight.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's basically the problem. I think it's that
it's comparable to other revolutions in that people fighting for an idea versus people fighting to defend the ways of the past, or people fighting just to prevent complete chaos. So usually in a revolution, the side that has an idea associated with it, tends to win.
Yep.
But another thing that helped the Bolsheviks win was the fact that they controlled most of the agriculture, which
that makes sense.
Can obviously help one side win in the Civil War. But in the American Civil War, on the other hand, the side that had probably less agriculture ended up winning, the Union. And the Union didn't have a specific idea as much as the South did in terms of preventing slavery. So I think in terms of civil wars, it always just comes down to which side has more resources. And I think the Bolsheviks had almost twice as many soldiers as the White Army.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
They had a lot of casualties too, but they had twice as much strength.
Yeah. I'm really interested though in the dedication factor here, because if you think about it, right, the conviction of the thought, the beliefs of the White Army was just not as strong, whereas the Bolsheviks, they were dedicated to their ideology. And this is interesting because it could lead to, say, a group from the White Army surrendering at a certain point where the Bolsheviks would have kept going for a while just because they are so dedicated to their ideology that they would rather keep fighting and possibly die for the sake of their beliefs. Whereas without like a central belief to lead the White Army, they ended up failing. So it's really like fascinating how that influences a war, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's it for me. Anything else?
Nah, that's the Reds versus the Whites.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. If it had gone the other way, like in some alternate history book or some movie, you know, it would be fun to look at what would have happened if the Reds didn't win.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about the Civil War too is that it was fought in many different theaters.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not only was it fought in Russia, but it was fought in a lot of the states surrounding Russia, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that helped the Reds eventually tip the scale, because as soon as people saw Maine having the revolution, other people in nearby states, some states that Russia had controlled at the time, began to join the Red side, whereas in those countries there would be almost no one willing to support the White side, because in those countries people were already disloyal to the monarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's interesting what Sebastian said about the alternate history aspect, is that, if the White Army had won the Russian Civil War, there likely would have been like a second Russian Civil War between loyalists and moderates. So that would be people that want the king, the Tsar, to be reinstated versus people that want the Duma back, you know? Because they were both fighting on the same side, because they pretty much put aside their differences and were like, okay, we have disagreements. And that's quite a bit of disagreement, you know, democracy versus monarchy. But they were both just equally, like, not enthused by the Bolshevik ideology. So they united against that. But yeah, it's kind of like people are able to unite against a common enemy, but once that common enemy is defeated, then they are not able to unite anymore. So that's probably kind of what would have happened. Yeah, it's just kind of like the Bolsheviks were sort of fated to win in a sense, because the White Army, they were just too unstable. You know, there would be too much infighting if they had won. So then the Bolsheviks would just rise up again. So yeah. All right, I'm gonna go to the next slide.
Let's move on.
Okay.
To
now we have
execution of the Romanov family. So there was like a Disney movie called Anastasia. Anastasia is the girl on she's like fifth one going from left to right. Okay. She's like 2 in from the right, or 3. And the Disney movie has like her just like being a Disney princess, you know, like talking to animals and like living a happy life and stuff. I think Rasputin is actually the villain.
Yeah, he's the villain.
So it is very historically incorrect because she dies here. They were executed. What day was it?
I think they were executed at their like palace, right?
July 16th, 1918. They took them down to like their basement, and they weren't at their palace. They were on the run for a while because they knew that they had.
They knew that they were in trouble.
They were gonna die.
Was it their winter home? Because I remember.
Yeah, I think it was one of their other.
Okay.
But they were moved a lot.
Yeah.
And they were told like, "Yo, we're gonna take a picture." So they all go down to their basement, and they basically get shot. And then there was a lot of stuff about like, oh, where were they buried and stuff, but they were all pretty much buried in a mass grave. Like some of them might have been spread out, but I don't know the specifics. But there was like some mystery about that.
Yeah, there was controversy
that got
for a while.
solved.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah, they used recently, and by recently I mean since DNA evidence has been a thing, they used that to solve it.
Yeah.
Kind of like a cold case where it's just unsolved, but then once DNA evidence becomes a thing, it's just bam, easy to solve. But yeah, so the Tsar, his wife, then 4 daughters and their son, they were all executed. And, you know, that's fairly cruel, but from the perspective of the Bolsheviks, what they were doing was that they had to execute the whole family so that the loyalist section of the White Army had nothing to stand on, because if the entire, this was the Romanov family, if the entire Romanov family was out of the picture permanently, then the loyalists wouldn't have anyone to be loyal to, you know? There wouldn't be a Tsar.
Yeah.
They would have to, like, find some, like, distant relative to be the new Tsar, and, you know, that's a murky prospect. So the Bolsheviks, they were just kind of being tactical here and essentially saying, like, okay, if there are any, like, Romanovs left, then there will always be people to unite behind them, right? So that's why, you know, that's why they killed them all, even though, you know, some of them were children, which is pretty bad of a thing to do morally, right?
Amongst most of the Bolsheviks, or some of them, the decision was actually not that popular. It's not like every Bolshevik wanted to see the Tsars dead. A lot of them actually wanted them exiled. But I think like Max said, the higher members of the Bolshevik Party saw it as more of a tactical decision and not something that could be avoided. It also sort of started this fear of communism and of the Bolshevik Party, because as soon as the news that they had been executed spread to Britain and other areas, people there started viewing the Bolsheviks as like monsters, or communism as being like cruel and heartless, essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just that, it's...
I would like to address chat.
Oh, okay. We have Jan McCarthy, 1975, says, Russia. Thank you. That is so insightful.
Thanks, Jam.
Good.
Yep, he figured it out.
He figured it out, everyone.
Well, at this point, it's actually the USS. Well, actually, where we are now, it's the USSR yet.
Just Bolshevik Republic.
Yeah. Anyway, so
not even you fool.
Yeah. But this political execution, right? It's definitely not the first, but this is kind of like, it sets the mood for the later, like, years of the USSR as we get into it, is that, you know, execution of political rivals or exiling of political rivals was just kind of, I mean, it was probably viewed negatively by most people, but they still did it, you know? Like, Stalin had a lot of political executions, and he was, you know, he didn't, I mean, people, I'm not sure what the conception was. I don't know how well people knew about it, but there was definitely a lot of fear and paranoia that ended up being spread. But this is, like, kind of what started this sort of mentality that political rivals, like, have to be executed, otherwise they're a liability, which is, you know, it ends up resulting in a lot of violence. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So, rip to the Romanov family.
Also,
thoughts and prayers.
Yep. Thoughts and prayers. I mean, if you use the definition of 4 or more people, then it was a mass shooting. So, yeah.
Ooh, thoughts and prayers.
Yep. Anyways, so next slide.
Next up, we got
more death.
Man is ripped to Lenin.
Yeah. So death of Vladimir Lenin. He had medical conditions. It was
he had like 3 strokes.
Yeah, he had 3 strokes, and the last one, complications, ended up killing him. So this is interesting because this occurred just a few years after the Bolsheviks took power, and that's kind of that's important because they were rallying behind this.
Not a good start.
Yeah,
not what they wanted to see.
Yeah, they were rallying behind this leader, behind this personality, right, of Vladimir Lenin, and then he just dies. It leaves the Bolsheviks like without a head, you know.
Yeah.
And so that it created a power vacuum that Stalin ends up filling, but this was just not a good situation. Like ideally, a leader would have like been in good health and continued to live long after the revolution, um, and that would have kept things more on track to what like Lenin envisioned. But what ended up happening was Stalin took over and he had things go towards how he wanted them to go, because he could. So
yeah, with Lenin's death, you kind of see the death of true communism in Russia, because although the USSR obviously remain a socialist republic, it would become a totalitarianistic government.
Yeah.
And the government power, or the power of the state, would become so large that things eventually wouldn't be equally shared amongst its people. And I don't think if Lenin had lived longer, I don't think that it would have happened as much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true. The death of Vladimir Lenin was, I mean, it's unfortunate for the movement that he wanted to create, for what he wanted to do. His death ended up like canceling a lot of that. So it's interesting what would have happened. There's always these what if questions with history of like, what if he had been in good health and things continued? People have their views on what would have happened, but it's definitely interesting. Well, it's definitely important to acknowledge that the death of Vladimir Lenin is what led to Stalin taking power and what led to all of the negative things that Stalin ended up doing, which we'll see in a moment. But yeah, so this was an event that occurred very shortly after the revolution. All right. So
yeah, and before Lenin died, he like left instructions and saying that like don't let Stalin take power. Like he wanted to give the power to I don't remember if it was Trotsky or someone else, but he was like, don't let Stalin take power. He's too militaristic and he's like not going to be a good leader. And then he died, and then Stalin took power
by eliminating all the other competition.
Exactly. Yeah. What was Stalin's position in the Communist Party or Socialist, whatever party it was?
He's like a protege, I think, of Lenin, but Lenin also knew that he wasn't necessarily suited to lead, because he would eventually like turn the Union into being completely about him. Pretty much happened.
Yeah. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Oh, that was gonna be okay. Well, this is a meme. Yeah, I was like keying up to like I was getting the music ready. Anyways, yeah, so that's a meme. So yeah, just look at that for a moment. Okay, next slide. All right, Joseph
Stalin.
The man himself.
The man.
Yep. So Joseph Stalin, he was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1924 until 1953. So that's, 29 years. 29 years of Joseph Stalin's lead. That's nearly 3 decades, and he did a lot in shaping the image of this republic. He was not only was he the leader, right, but he was also like the face of Russia, right? He like had a personality cult behind him, so people were very devoted to him specifically as a leader, and it had some interesting results. Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Joseph Stalin, one of the big three. He was definitely a controversial figure. He caused he caused more deaths than like Hitler did.
Yeah.
But for him, I don't it wasn't systematic though. It was just like a consequence of bad leadership, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like there were gulags, like sure, and we'll talk about those, but I think a lot of people who died were just like citizens that didn't get enough food.
Oh, okay.
But yeah. So his name, even his real name isn't Joseph Stalin. He like changed it.
Yeah, Stalin means man of steel.
Yeah, man of steel.
Yeah, that's why he changed it to that. To seem more powerful. You know.
I think he changed it before Superman became a thing.
Yeah.
So is Superman communist? Yes, in one comic strip. Yeah, in the Red Sun comic strip, which is literally just what would have happened if Superman landed in Russia instead of Kansas.
That's interesting. That's an interesting premise.
You can look it up. It's called Red Sun Superman, and it's just Superman with the hammer and sickle on his chest.
Wow. Yep, there were a lot of like interesting comics because they had the multiverse, so they could kind of toy around with whatever they wanted, right? Like they could have an interesting timeline thought experiment and not have it like actually ruin everything, you know? So that's interesting. Yeah. All right. So shall we get into the first slide?
Yes.
Okay.
The consolidation of power.
So Stalin, when he took power, I'm not going to say the first, but, you know, one of the first things he did was he wanted to make sure that no one could challenge his leadership because, as evidenced from the Russian Revolution, you know, it's very unstable who's in charge. It was the Tsar, you know, it was the Romanov family. Then it was the Duma, and then it was Lenin. But, like, you know, 2/3 of those groups have now died. So Stalin is like, okay, I don't want to lose my power and probably die because losing power in this situation probably would have meant death, right? So the first thing he did to consolidate his power was he exiled 2 of his nemesis, Leon Trotsky and Grigory Zinoviev. So I know he exiled Trotsky to Argentina, right? Like South America.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know about Zinoviev, but
also I want to point out the fact that Trotsky's mustache is the perfect example of a 5.
That's true. That
but what about Stalin?
Stalin's? Oh, I gotta go 10. Look at that.
I do not think.
Do you disagree?
Trotsky got exiled to.
But yeah, so
somewhere I'm figuring it out. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, it's fine. So he exiled and then eventually killed Trotsky, right? He ended up having Trotsky killed in his.
Yes, and there was also a propaganda attack against Trotsky.
Yeah, so
he made Trotsky look bad.
Yeah, so this was interesting because after the death of Lenin, Trotsky could have become the leader instead of Stalin. Like they were.
Yeah, he was just kicked out of the Soviet Union as a whole.
They were both people that could have taken lead. So once Stalin did take lead, the first thing he wanted to do was, you know, get rid of that liability, get rid of the possibility that Trotsky could take over from him if he were to have poor leadership. So that's basically the problem, because
he felt,
by getting rid of political rivals, it means that even if you end up having like bad leadership, people aren't going to be able to replace you with someone. So if Trotsky had remained in the U.S.S.R. and Stalin hadn't consolidated his power, then if he ended up like making bad decisions, once the famines returned and people started getting hungry, they might have been like, okay, he's not working, we have to get rid of him. And he did not want that to happen. So that's kind of why, like, Stalin ended up getting rid of so many political rivals. Like Trotsky and Zinoviev, they are just, the first, But later, which we'll see, he ends up just mass getting rid of any political rival, and these would be like minor figures, just like a local leader or something like that, who isn't 100% in agreement with him. And that's interesting.
Or even just regular people that opposed him.
Yeah, regular people that opposed him. Even some people that were 100% on board with Stalin ended up getting executed because Stalin was like, yeah, you have the exact same like political views as me, which means that you could try to replace me, right? Would you say he's paranoid or just calculating?
He's definitely paranoid.
Yeah, so he just...
I think he's paranoid, but he also knows that, or he at least thinks that the situation that Russia is in at the time requires one person to basically just, like, completely take control of everything in order to catch up to the rest of the world, because he basically wants not only to make Russia a global superpower, but to expand Russia's influence. And he said that Russia had fallen behind the advanced countries by 50 to 100 years, and that they have to close that gap in only 10 years in order to not be crushed by the other
countries. So from just 1936 to 1938, there were anywhere from 681,000 to 1.2 million deaths. And that was the period of time called the Great Purge. And we're going to talk about purges later. But Stalin was definitely, I got to say, Stalin was paranoid. Because, like, there's no way that, like, 1.2 million people, like, of those, and I know that's highball, but it's like, come on, man.
Yeah.
You do not need to be afraid of all those people. And especially because he had like power, and he made himself look so good from like the propaganda. And that's propaganda that you see. And we have the translation from the Russian above it. But there was all this propaganda, and like Zach, because Max and I like found this out. But Zach, how tall did you think Stalin is? Like, how tall did you think he was?
Oh, isn't he like 5'10", but he lied in propaganda or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. People thought that, like, if you went around and asked, how tall is Joseph Stalin? People would give you anywhere from, like, 6 foot, like, 5 to, like, 6'8", or, like, anything. But, he was, like, his left arm. And he was, how tall was he? He was...
Wasn't it 5'8", I think?
Yeah, anywhere from 5'5".
Wow.
So, yeah. He was not a tall guy.
Yeah, that would be like
he was 5 foot.
Yeah.
Which is like however many centimeters, but
yeah.
Just look at that, that's the same height as Angela Merkel of Germany. It's like,
yeah, 5'8". Wow.
But you would think he would be towering. Like, you guys remember the documentary?
Yeah, they showed us this documentary in a history class that we were all
that
in.
dude was like at least 6.
Yeah, the actor. Totally.
Yeah, that guy played Stalin better than Stalin.
He did. Yeah.
Oh, he was so intimidating. Like
every time he came on, laugh.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wasn't the first scene where Stalin was introduced in that documentary? It was like out of like mist or fog or something. Like he was walking like into the scene from like
find
mist.
That documentary.
It was so intimidating, so scary. So that's like not the scary part, but that's how Stalin like made himself seem. He made himself seem like this great, powerful leader, like, and so like it made a lot of people like total fans of him, and anyone that like actually saw behind the veil ended up needing to be executed again because it's this image that he's trying to put of himself being like so powerful. And even if someone like doesn't necessarily disagree with him, but just like knows that that's not what he's like, then that's dangerous because public conception needs to be, from his perspective, that he is like this great leader. Um, so that's interesting because it's all this propaganda, and it's such a odd way of leadership. Like it's very different from what we're familiar with here. But then you can also see aspects of it like with image and stuff. Like whenever a politician gets sick, they never admit it. You know, they're like, "Oh, I'm fine, I'm fine." Like, "Oh, what? My nose is bleeding. Oh, sorry, I'm fine." you know,
Yeah.
because you always have to present yourself as like really healthy. Otherwise, I think it was like during the 2016 election, there were people that were like pointing out like Hillary Clinton didn't look very healthy, right? Like a lot of conservatives were saying that, like Republicans to like discredit her, like that she's not fit to lead because she's not healthy. So just physical appearance and health uh, is very important in being like a leader that people look up to. So yeah, you definitely see aspects of that in our politics, but here it's like taken up to the max because that's pretty much like what he has to worry about. He has to worry about his own image and possible rivals. So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, sure.
This is how Stalin actually exercised the power that he worked so hard to preserve through the 5-year plans.
Yeah, so Russia, by the end, they had 13 5-year plans by the end of the USSR. Or, yeah, CCCP. You see that. That's how it was spelled in Cyrillic. That was the acronym. Yeah, you've probably seen that before in like a movie or something. You've probably seen CCCP. But yeah, so Stalin, so the first 5-year plan was a plan to catch up to the rest of the world with a lot of industrialization, right? And this is where you see all the implementation of what we think of as like life inside the USSR, right? So Zach, what do you know about this plan, this first 5-year plan?
The first 5-year plan?
Yeah.
It basically was designed to completely control agricultural production, maximize industrial efficiency, and it relied heavily on like forced labor, which he would supply from gulags and other techniques. But it established quotas that people had to make, and the quotas were often counterproductive because although it boosted the total production, it would come back to hurt the USSR because the quotas would not allow farmers to have enough food for themselves, which would result in like widespread famine and eventually decrease the amount of people farming. And the quotas were like not realistic. So basically, Stalin expected people to produce more than what they were capable of, which led to them resenting him and not being able to produce anything at all.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So before this period, like you didn't have things like collectives, right? The collective farms or the forced labor. Like this was the start of that, because he needed this to actually execute the plan of industrializing. Like he needed this manpower. So yeah, so that's fascinating. So how successful would you say it was? Like in completing its goals, it was probably fairly successful, but the side effects and the aftermath of what he did to achieve those goals probably made it less successful from a historical perspective, right?
Yeah, historically, it's probably a good example of the ends not
Mm.
necessarily justifying the, because
Mm-hmm.
although he helped Russia, or at this time the Soviet Union, uh, reach the same level of industrialization as other countries, he took a loss of so many people that it would not help the USSR's ability to be sustainable in the future, especially in the world wars. It led to them having like terrible, like the worst military equipment because people produced it just to meet the quotas, and no one actually cared if it worked. So they would make tanks that just flat out didn't have engine, so that people could inspect the factory, see that they made enough for the quota. So it increases production, but when that happens, the quality of the goods also decreases, and that was definitely not useful.
Yeah, so essentially it solved one problem, which was the lack of industrialization, by creating a ton of different problems.
Yeah,
So
I think something like that had to happen.
yeah,
It should have started sooner, and it probably would have if there wasn't the few years in between Lenin's death where they were tussling over who would actually be in charge. So it was a tough scenario once Stalin actually got into power, which kind of motivated him to do it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's it for me.
Yeah, we can head over to the next one.
Cool. Okay, so Gulags. So these were the forced labor camps that Russia maintained. So they sent a lot of, political dissidents here, people that disagreed with Stalin, with the government. They would send them here to do work, and these were often places in very harsh conditions. Like they were in Siberia, like the tundra. It got very cold, and people had to do this work. And again, there were quotas installed, so like you had to do X amount of work in a day, and like you weren't allowed to sleep until you finished all that work. And yeah, so this is part of what helped fuel Russia, like helped the 5-year plan move along, was all this forced labor. So, yeah.
Yeah. Gulags were pretty bad. They were all work camps, right? I don't think they were death camps.
No. They would have just killed them.
Gulag,
if they wanted them.
Yeah,
dead.
Exactly. Yeah, they're all labor camps.
Yeah.
Gulag is an acronym.
It's
like the
I should have capitalized.
The Russian acronym for the main administration. And in Russian, the initials of that is Gulag.
Okay.
So, yeah, in the Gulag, prisoners could work up to like 14 hours per day. Prisoners might spend their days knocking down trees with handsaws and axes, or being at frozen ground with primitive pickaxes. So, not fun.
Yeah. Also, they were like underfed because generally there were all these famines. So why would they treat their prisoners any better? So from 1929 to 1953, more than 14 million people passed through a gulag. So more than 14 million people were in a gulag at one point or another. And another 7 to 8 million were deported and exiled to remote areas of the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule. So 14 million people in these gulags. I'm sure a large percentage of those like died just due to the terrible conditions. And then you put on top of that the Purges, which we'll talk about next, and the
other people that died of a result of not having enough resources, like the farmers who, under the quotas, didn't have enough for themselves, and and that's when you start to get an idea of why Stalin has a higher kill count than Hitler does.
Yeah, so that's interesting. The Gulags, pretty much, summary of like life in one of these. They were overworked, underfed, and it would often be freezing cold. So just very bad, like horrible conditions. So it ended up killing some people. Like a lot of people were not able to handle the stress, and like died because of this. So yeah, that's it from me. Do you have anything to add, anybody? Or should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, no, Gulags, not good. Don't recommend. Let's go over to Purges.
Right. Unless it's Minecraft. Then they're fine.
Yeah.
So now we've got Purges. So this is an interesting picture.
This image.
I would hope most people watching would understand this picture, but maybe some wouldn't, so I'm just going to explain. It's from the anime Death Note, right? Yeah, and so, it's basically where you're able to write a name down in this notebook, and then the person dies, right? And the notebook's associated with this, like, god of death, like Shinigami, and this one's Ryuk.
That's the dude behind Stalin in this picture.
Yeah, and so the reason that this picture, not only is it, kind of humorous, because it's, from the anime, but it's also actually, like, kind of true, because Stalin, because he was so powerful, he would be able to just write down a list of names, like, give it to his, like his employees, or not employees, they weren't employed, but, the people under him, right? Yeah, he was able to give it to his people, and then they would just go and kill the people that he wrote down on the list. So it's like the closest thing in real life to a death note. Because he was able to just have these people killed. And this was interesting. I think there were accounts that, like, every day, like, before he went to bed or something, like, he would just spend, like, an hour writing down 1,000 names or something. Every single day. That's a lot of people. So he would just write down, like, people he was, like, thought were against him.
Which, again, makes you wonder if he was, like, crazy, or if he just knew that if he got rid of all those people, he would be successful, and no one would be able to take his power away. I mean, it's impossible to put an actual him, but I think he thought that them all existing at once poses a threat to him. So he wanted to create fear. That's why he did it.
Yeah, definitely.
Was to create fear.
It definitely creates fear, because if these people, end up getting killed, then it discourages other people from becoming political dissidents. So whether or not the people actually posed a threat to him, for every person he killed, right, he probably, like, dissuaded, 5-10 others from, like, deviating from just, like, the set thing. Because I would say most people probably aren't, like, that courageous, to stand up to, like, a regime like that, like, in their own ways, right? So most people would probably see this, and even if they held the same beliefs as some of the people that were executed, were like, no, I don't want to get killed from this, so I'm just going to pretend as if nothing's wrong. I'm not going to, like, go against the government. So yeah, definitely created a lot of fear in Russia.
Yeah, so definitely going into more of how Stalin wasn't the best.
Yeah.
Yeah, so lots of paranoia and lots of other stuff, and the leaders around this time period were not the best. And I feel like, I don't know how it is. Like, I have some Russian friends that I could ask, but the guy we always default to being a terrible leader is, of course, Hitler. but I feel like that's like a global thing. But I wonder if in Russia people like default to Stalin as being a leader.
I'm not sure.
It might be interesting to see.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Yeah.
I think Stalin covered up his atrocities much better and was less like direct about them. And also in terms of personality, Stalin, despite being such a terrible person, was sort of charismatic in a very strange way. And a lot of people associated him, like we said earlier, as with like a god or a holy figure that should never be challenged. So I think there were probably a lot of people that respected him and thought he was a good leader, just not those that he attacked. And he controlled the media, and one of the specific things about that, next slide, right?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah. Here we go. So this is Pravda. And we have a picture of Elon Musk. Because Elon Musk a while ago proposed creating like a website where people could rate how much they trusted different news sources, and he said he wanted to call it Pravda. I don't know why he wanted to call it Pravda, but Pravda was the centralized like news source in the U.S.S.R. So this is a major aspect of, keeping the people under control is by controlling the media and controlling what they hear, like news events, what they hear about. And like, if you've ever, watched the news and then taken a break from watching the news, it greatly like impacts your views of the world, Like sometimes I'll watch the news for a bit because I'm fascinated and I'm like, I got to keep up with current events, I need to know what's happening. But then it just kind of tends to depress me, So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to watch this. And then I just stop watching the news. So that's really how powerful the news is in influencing people. So Pravda was used to keep people loyal to the government. So, yeah. So what do you guys have on this?
So it also functioned to like control Soviet art, and the Soviet culture had evolved so that essentially their art was completely distinctive from the rest of the world, because influence was like seldom got past the Iron Curtain, basically. Like nothing from the Western world really influenced the USSR, and it was sort of stuck with the influence that it had received like pre-1900s. So it reviewed oftentimes like artists such as Shostakovich, who is one of the most well-known Soviet composers. And if your art was deemed like as something that was not representative of the party's beliefs, or something that supported the communist ideology, then you could face either deportation, or they would just completely outlaw the performance of any of your works. And this happened a lot to Shostakovich. And the criticisms were published through Pravda, which people just assumed it was something that they should like listen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the media is super influential in controlling how people think. Yeah, that's
especially when there isn't competition.
Yeah,
media sources.
Yeah. At least here, like in the U.S., in modern times, like definitely the media can like influence what someone thinks, but there are other sources to check that. So as long as you like vary what you watch, like don't just watch one source of news. I'm not going to call out any specific source of news because that will instantly have half the audience disappear, right? Just Thanos snap. There are two like major news sources I could criticize right now, and criticizing either one of them would snap away the population, right? Right?
Yeah, I
You know
think you
the
should
two.
stick with Inklings news.
Yeah, stick with the
Definitely.
Inklings.
Inklings is definitely the way to go for news updates. 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my school's newspaper is the Torch. Yeah, it's like
Nice.
it's funny. It's so there's elementary school, middle school, and high school, and like the elementary school is called like the Match or something, like the Match, and then the middle school is the Spark,
Oh, it evolved.
and then
It's like
ours is the
Pokemon.
Torch, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so that's Pravda. Oh yeah, wait, who's the guy in the top left? Was he like he was in charge of it, right?
No, the guy in the top left is a picture of.
Oh, okay. So he was
Yeah,
stressed.
another interesting thing about the culture is that they had a lot of political jokes, and telling them was like an extreme sport, basically, because if the wrong person heard you, you could actually like be charged with a capital offense. But some of them are pretty funny. I mean, maybe they're not so funny, but they're funny to us now.
Yeah.
So an example joke is, who built the White Sea Canal?
Who?
And the answer is, the left bank was built by those who told the jokes, and the right bank by those who listened. So it kind of shows like the gulags and I don't know.
Yeah.
The complete control. Even if you like listen.
Yeah.
Anti-communist, then you could also be at risk.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, should I go to the next slide? Oh yeah, this is a piece of art.
Yeah, now we go
Yeah.
to the Winter War.
Or well, wait, Zach, do you want to explain this quickly? The Natalia Goncharova.
Oh yeah,
Oh right, my bad.
That's just an example of a Russian artist that I thought was pretty interesting, because she, instead of being exiled, she just chooses to leave before like all of this chaos happened. And you start to wonder, like, not only how many people were exiled, but how many people chose to leave the Soviet Union. It sort of kind of acted to spread all of Russian culture, especially pre-USSR culture. Like, suddenly became more relevant to the rest of the Western world, because there was a lot of migration out of the USSR. And she's just an interesting artist.
Yeah.
I like a lot of her.
Interesting. All right. So yeah, next slide.
Now we go on to
the Winter War.
So yeah, this was the war between Finland and the Soviet Union. And when you just say that, you're like, the Soviet Union sounds way more powerful than Finland. But it was actually like much different than what people would have thought. Finland actually ended up, like, I don't know if they officially won, but they pretty much, because the number of Soviets dead compared to the number of Finnish dead is like way slanted over to the Soviet side.
And Finland, did they remain independent? Like, were they able to?
They remained independent, but they had to sign a treaty. They had to give up some land. But considering that they risked like complete control, if they had lost the war, the Soviets would have just completely taken over. So
Finland, up until 1917, or like during the Russian Revolution, before the Russian Revolution, Finland was a part of Russia, but once the Bolsheviks took power, Finland wanted no part in that, so then they separated.
Stalin actually granted them independence before he became the head of the U.S.S.R. But the conflicts would come back because of border disputes, as well as the League of Nations regulating the peace treaties that had occurred between the two nations. So
interesting.
So there were 70,000 casualties on the Finnish side and 380,000 casualties on Soviet Union side. and it was a pretty interesting war because of the war tactics on each side. Like the Finnish pretty much dressed in all white and the location to their advantage, while the Soviets wore like red uniforms that just completely gave them away.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Similar thing happened during like American Revolutionary War with the redcoats. Generally, pro tip: if you are going to war, don't wear red. It's like the most obvious color. Like I cannot think of a situation where red would be tactical, like an advantage.
War on Mars, dude.
Yeah, War on Mars. Yeah, wear red for the War on Mars. That's the only situation. Yeah, that's true. But on Earth, there aren't any environments that are red. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so the guy in the picture for the Winter War that we have up here, that is the White Death. He's the best sniper ever. His real name is, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but it's Simo Heya, I think. And he's credited with over 500, which is pretty impressive when you consider those 500 enemy kills all happened within 100. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And because the Winter War lasted from the 30th of November 1939 to the 13th of March, so 2 days ago, 19. So pretty interesting that he was able to do all that. And I don't know if that's the gun that he continually used, but there's no scope on that. Yeah. So if he got all 500 kills without a scope, then this dude needs to like hop on the Xbox, bro. Join my team.
Yeah. The Winter War, it's really interesting.
Yeah, he used an M28 rifle that did not have a scope.
Oh my god!
During most of the years that he.
Wow.
But you could attach a scope to it. I'm guessing he probably.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and when he got interviewed after, right? He died in 2002, so I like way closer than you might have thought.
Yeah.
They asked him the secret of how he fought from sniper kills. All he would say is practice.
Practice.
I think that's pretty fun.
Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting, though, because usually winter comes to Russia's advantage in warfare. Like, if you think of the Napoleonic Wars, like, Napoleon invading Russia in the winter, he failed. When Germany tried to invade Russia in the winter in World War II, they failed, which was a little after this. But winter usually helps Russia. Like, Russia usually knows how to handle winter, so it's odd that they were not equipped for this.
Yeah, you would expect Russia to win the win. You know?
Yeah. But I guess if there's one, like, compared to other than Russia, right, it's got to be Scandinavia that has the worst winters, you know? So,
yeah,
I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, and he got most of his kills on days where there were almost no daylight hours. And in between temperatures of -40 and -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow. I think he probably just became so accustomed to the conditions that he was at a level above everyone else.
Interesting. Yeah, but so what does this war reflect? I guess it reflects that
it shows the USSR's inability to maintain its empire. Like it had stretched over so much territory that it was bound to lose control in certain regions. And even though it had produced so much and had large numerical statistical advantages, a lot of its equipment and tactics were still really outdated and kind of superficially created because they didn't actually know that the USSR was power that was able to do whatever it wanted.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, they were spreading themselves too thin, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you can see that start to hurt them in World War II as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, sure. Go on to World War II.
So
this is another picture.
Here we have the big three.
Yeah.
FD.
Yep.
And very important. World War II is a topic in and of itself.
Yeah.
But specifically from the Russian perspective, Russia fought with the and yeah, that's a fact I think. That in both world wars, Russia fought with like America, or like at least and now they're kind of like an enemy of the US.
Yeah.
Well, especially after the Cold War, I think since then they've been not necessarily the US's closest ally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because things could have been the other way around. Like Germany had actually made a pact with Russia. Was it like the Warsaw Pact, right?
I think.
Yeah, where Germany and Russia were like, okay, we'll fight together in this war. And then
or they would at least agree not to fight each other.
Yeah, that was it. They wouldn't fight each other, right? So they said, we won't fight each other. I think they also decided to invade Poland together and to like split Poland.
Yeah, to split it up.
And that's what actually caused the other nations, like Britain, to declare war on Germany, was when they invaded Poland. But eventually Germany ends up, betraying this pact and invades Russia, and Russia's like, dude, what are you doing? So then they join the Allies. But it's interesting because at first people were like, what? Communism and fascism are natural enemies, right? You always hear that phrase. I heard that phrase so many times in history class. Like, they would always say, communism and fascism are natural enemies. But yeah, so it was interesting. People were very shocked when this pact occurred, and Germany and Russia were like, okay, we won't invade each other. But then Germany broke the pact, so then Russia was upset about that, so then they joined the Allies.
Yeah, Operation Barbarossa was probably the biggest mistake made in World War II. Because it just aggravated an entire new that proved to be completely catastrophic for the German.
Yeah, definitely.
And coming out of World War II, you see even further destruction of European powers, which is partially why the USSR is able to rise to the position that it does at that time.
Yeah, because by the end of World War II, Germany, which has often been a major superpower, ends up becoming, split between four nations, Britain, US, France, and Russia. But essentially split in two because US, France, and Britain are like allied, so that's the East Germany, West Germany. But it was technically split between these four nations. It's just that three of them cooperated with each other and one of them did not. And that one was Russia. So Germany could no longer be a major power because it's being occupied by other nations. And then France, lots of damage done because of the warfare. Not as much as there could have been, because it's often criticized of France's early surrender, right? But a lot of people say that they could have only gone like another month, and if they had, you would have seen a lot of destruction of like French architecture. So it's interesting. But again, France was heavily hit in both world wars because a lot of the fighting occurred there. But then Britain was also heavily hit, if you've heard of like all the bombings in London and all the different cities in England. That left its mark too. So the U.S. ended up relatively unscathed because it was on the other side of the ocean. Of course, there was Pearl Harbor, but other than that, major cities were not bombed, right? So that's interesting. But the Soviet Union is also interesting because they did receive quite a bit of damage and like loss of life, but they were able to emerge as a superpower after that. Like they stayed strong. It's often said, have you heard the phrase that it's like World War II was won with like it was like British brains, like American brawn, and Russian blood, like won the war. Essentially, because Britain planned all the tactical, like they had a ton of like tactical knowledge. The U.S. supplied a lot of the weapons, like the tanks and the guns, and the USSR had a lot of, it had a very large army, and ended up like having a lot of deaths from the war. So yeah, if you've heard that phrase, that's what that means. Yeah. So yeah, by the end of World War II, the USSR and the US were the two world superpowers, and this is where the Cold War starts because these two conflicting ideologies of democracy and like totalitarian like communism were conflicting all over the world. Like you end up seeing proxy wars and stuff, but that's for a bit later. Yeah. So should I go to the next slide?
Yes.
Cool. Oh yeah. Call back. Remember this episode? Season 2, episode 5. Yeah. Anyways. Okay. Territory gains. So after the war, the Soviet Union gained a lot of territory in like proxy nations, satellite states. So these satellite states, you've got East Germany, Poland, like Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, all these countries that while they weren't absorbed into the Soviet Union, they didn't become an actual part of the nation itself. They ended up having puppet governments. So the USSR was in control of their government. And it kept them allied with the Soviet government. And pretty much what it ensured was that if the U.S. backed Britain and France to launch an invasion into Russia, they would first have to go through a couple nations before actually getting to the mainland. So it's kind of like a human shield, right? But like a country shield. So this is like a physical barrier between the democratic Western nations and Russia that they would have to pass if they ever wanted to invade, which never ended up occurring, but, it could have, so it was a contingency plan, Yeah. So, yeah, that's that.
Yeah, Russia likes land.
Mm-hmm.
Much like other countries.
Mm.
And it's interesting because Russia currently is trying to expand back into Ukraine, and that has caused a lot of tensions.
Yeah.
If you look at the Democratic candidates, which as of now are Bernie and Joe Biden, one of the questions that they're asked is like, how are you going to respond to Russia going into Ukraine territory? And when you first see that, you might be like, okay, why is that important? Like at all? Like it's definitely an issue, but like, is it that important? But when you look here at like the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union expansion, you start to see how it can be kind of an issue. And the argument can be made that if we don't learn from our history, then we are to repeat it.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Ukraine used to be not just a satellite state, but actually part of the Soviet Union.
Why do people say the Ukraine? Isn't it just Ukraine?
I didn't say the Ukraine. I just said Ukraine.
You said the Ukraine.
No, you said the Ukraine.
I said the Ukraine?
Yeah, and a lot of people do USSR as well. No, like
I thought I said the Soviet Union.
People say the USA.
You
would never say the France.
Why do people say?
Okay, Jan McCarthy says, "Don't make me gain your territory." Okay. I didn't think I said the Ukraine. I thought I just said.
You totally said the.
I'm gonna check.
I'll play.
I'm gonna check
it back.
the audio.
Back.
I'm gonna check it.
Oh, let's take a moment of silence.
Here, wait. I'm gonna check. No, wait. Keep going. Keep talking. I'm gonna check. Keep saying things while I check.
Hold on.
What do you think is the right course of action for the U.S. to do?
You said it. You totally said the.
Okay.
I just listened to it back. But anyways.
Oh, I did. Okay, I did say it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right, Zach. What was your question?
I said, what do you think the U.S. should do about Ukraine? Because I don't know if it's necessarily our place to get involved, but at the same time, we don't want them like completely screwing over Ukraine.
Well, when it comes to not our place to get involved, I think Russia can't be criticizing us for that. Right?
True. That's true.
But we also need to talk about how this, like, we need to make a note that after the U.S.S.R. collapsed, how each individual satellite state, like Lithuania and like Estonia.
Well, those were actually part of the Union, not just satellite states.
Well, yeah. But I'm saying, like, stuff like that. How were they affected by the USSR falling apart? Like, did they scramble to, like, rebuild their economy? Did they thrive? All that needs to be taken into account. And especially when you look at Ukraine, Ukraine was a big part of the USSR because that was basically one of its main entries into Europe. So them going after Ukraine again would definitely bring up some bad blood that occurred because of World War II and because of just Soviet encroachment. You know? Yeah. So Ukraine is kind of like northern in a way. You could look at it like that. Because it's a very heated area because of a lot of past conflicts. So much so that when the Soviet Union, when Russia starts encroaching on that, people immediately think back to what happened when the Soviet Union was a thing. You know, and they think back to Stalin and how millions died under his control. How Ukraine probably suffered and did suffer under Stalin's rule. That's not good. No one wants that to happen. Ukraine definitely wants its independence, and Russia encroaching on it is definitely an issue. And in an ideal world, it would be the UN's, the UN's issue to deal with. Like, all the countries would come together, Ukraine would get a voice, and we would all get to, like, figure out what the best possible scenario is.
The
UN is useless.
Yeah, it tends not to be good.
And I make better decisions than the UN, like, at 3 a.m. And I probably have more, like, sway than they do, quite honestly, because everyone is just against each other. So the net changes. And
you run a YouTube channel with like 17 subscribers. That's probably more than
21.
21.
So
you've far surpassed the UN in ability.
I gotta say
to influence.
But anyways, the thing is that because of the UN's inefficiency, who does it fall on to make the decision? The global peacekeeper, America. You know, that's
Arsenal
why our
of
candidates
democracy.
are being asked the question.
And
I just thought it was important to bring up how, and we're going to talk about current day Russia because this is the timeline. But it's one of these things that if Russia's getting back to its days of the Soviet Union, which it might be in Russia's interest to do, because you got to remember at the start of the stream we said that the USSR was the strongest Russia had ever been.
Mm-hmm.
I am sure that Putin, the current leader of Russia.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can go on to the death of Joseph Stalin.
Okay, yeah, death of Joseph Stalin. It was like a national like tragedy in a lot of ways.
People
like
were balling in the streets. Just
balling for Stalin.
Balling for Stalin.
Yeah, that's a common image when a leader of a like totalitarian government like this ends up dying. Like if you look at the deaths of previous leaders of North Korea, like you see all this video footage of just people crying out in like anguish, like they are just so like distraught that their leader has died. And that's what happened when Stalin died in 1953.
And you see, like, when a president dies, that like even when JFK got like people loved JFK.
Mm-hmm.
He gets assassinated, right? And people are sad. Yeah. No, people are absolutely distraught. It was a time of like national emergency.
Mm-hmm.
People like felt terrible that their president had been assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
People were like kind of anxious and kind of scared. But they went on with their lives. They still showed up to like when Joseph Stalin died, like the country stopped.
Just shut down.
For days, maybe even weeks. Like that's not the same. And that's probably going into the thing about how under Stalin's regime, the propaganda was so effective that people thought of him as a god. In North Korea, they're all brainwashed to think that their leaders, no matter who it is, they are like literal descendants of God, you know? But with Stalin, it was just more like the propaganda aspect was just making him seem like a hero, you know? Making him seem like Superman, you know? His last name might suggest.
Yep.
But
well, it's really,
you don't get that over here.
It's really interesting because if you look at Stalin, just like from his own perspective, he was he was successful, you know, because when he consolidated his power, like he didn't die from like being assassinated or deposed. He just died of like old age, health conditions. So he was able to successfully maintain his power up until his death, with his massive like purges, gulags, fear, propaganda. So it's interesting because, I mean, from his own perspective, obviously, he would be successful. So he was successful at what he was trying to do, even though that thing was bad. Which is like, it's interesting because it means like, it's crazy that this kind of thing can work. Like for like a person can cause all of these deaths, you know, like have these work camps, can like can just have completely biased like propaganda media, and they can successfully lead the country up until their deaths and like not be deposed, you know, and not be assassinated. It's just like crazy that it actually worked, you know.
Within the U.S.S.R, there were so many people that wanted to please Stalin and wanted to make sure that the country succeeded, and they truly believed in like his way of ruling, and the people that he had put in power like basically protected him and shielded him from having any risk. But once he dies, people start to realize that he didn't actually put the USSR into a position where it would be able to last forever.
Yeah.
Because the technology that developed through the 5-year plans, like I said, it was not very strong. And the entire idea of socialism like starts to collapse after death.
Yeah.
So it was definitely a major, but
yeah.
He died in
1953.
1953.
Yeah.
So that means that definitely like someone's grandparents would remember, right? if my math is correct.
Probably. I think people still would be affected by him.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, it'd be interesting if anyone has, like, Russian heritage to, like, ask your grandparents, like, how was Stalin's death?
They probably would not have a good opinion, especially if they did not stay in Russia for a long time.
Yeah.
Now we get into one of the more science.
Yeah. All right. Next slide.
Give us that cue. Give us that.
So, space race era. So, we've got some sci-fi music, synthwave. So the space race. The space race was a really interesting.
Was a race for space.
Yeah. Well, it was a really interesting thing because it progressed science a lot, but it was really just this thinly veiled, it was just another proxy war in essence. It was just a proxy war in space, right? It was a lot of all this competition, for images, just to make your nation look better through its power in space. And it's so fascinating because if you look at the history of the Apollo program, it ended in 1972 once the Soviets just gave up and said okay, we've lost the race, right? Which is kind of sad that space exploration will only occur this quickly if it's due to competition, right? Why can't we just do that now just because, just for the sake of space? But no, this space race era had this ulterior motive. So it's interesting because I do regard it well just because it did advance science, but in general, as a thing, right, the competition was kind of bad. But it depends on how you look on it, really. Because competition can really help things develop. But it's just kind of sad that the only development we see in space, the only really rapid development, comes from these periods of time with competition. Yeah. So, yeah. So this is 1954,
so
1975.
the space race was fire. Because it's like you just said, competition in any field, when it leads to more discoveries and it's beautiful thing.
Yeah.
You know?
It's kind of funny too because space race is sort of directly opposing socialism, because the entire reason that Russia succeeded in their space program was because they were competing with America. And in a lot of their other endeavors, they didn't really have any competition. So they were not motivated to do anything quickly.
Yeah,
that's very true.
So that's your argument right there. Yeah, so that's interesting. All right, so let's begin. So first slide, we have Sputnik, which is the Russian word for satellite. So they just named their first satellite. But yeah, this was the first.
Shout out to Soviet.
Yeah, this was the first.
Looks like an eyeball.
Yeah, I know. I love the Sputnik design. But yeah, this was the first man-made object to become a satellite of Earth. So it orbited the Earth. It maintained orbit. There were previous things that had gotten to the right height, they just got high enough that it was space, but nothing that was staying in orbit. So this was quite an accomplishment. And throughout the space race era, you actually see Russia make a lot of accomplishments before the U.S. And it's really just it's just the end of the space race with the moon landing, where Russia wasn't able to continue to succeed. There's this really interesting show called For All Mankind, and it's basically what would have happened if Russia landed on the moon first. And I like that show. It's interesting, because the competition would have kept going, and then more development would have happened on the moon. So that's fascinating. But yeah, Sputnik, the first Sputnik, Sputnik 1, is just this little sphere with 4 antennae, and it just orbited for a while. Um, yeah, so I mean, it's quite an accomplishment just
I feel
for
like
humanity.
I remember hearing stories of people in the U.S. like trying to go out to see it, and that would motivate them to become interested in space race. Like, regardless of what side any of the accomplishments were during the space race, they were impressive, and it wasn't really competition entirely because people just wanted to see the human race as a whole succeed.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So this is a very monumental, like, I've heard a lot of, like, if you ever hear of, like, new epochs for, like, calendars, like space calendars, a lot of people are like, oh, the first, like, year of the space calendar or whatever should be when Sputnik launched, because it was the first man-made object to successfully become a satellite of Earth. So yeah, this was this was 1957 as well, Sputnik 1. Very monumental, like, achievement for humanity. That's what I would say. So the USSR, it did succeed in a lot of respects with space. Had a lot of these, like, first steps, like a lot of these, what do you call them, like achievements for humanity. It's just that last one. It's just the moon landing where they failed. So yeah. So that's it about Sputnik. Sputnik, I mean, it was the first satellite, but it was very rudimentary. Very simple tools, instruments, because it wasn't meant to get up there to study science. I mean, it did, but it was meant to be there so that Russia could say we had it there, right? Like, that's the main accomplishment. That's like how these things were motivated. I would say especially so in the Soviet Union, like more so than the U.S. I would say there's more of a focus on just getting the achievement instead of actually, like, discovering, like, new things in science. I mean, both sides did do both, right?
Yeah.
But Sputnik, if you think about it, like, they could have taken more time to put in more scientific instruments and gather more useful data. But that's not what the space race was about. It was about being first for a ton of achievements. So I guess that's the negative side of competition. Like, competition can be good and bad. And the good is that it spurred on this space race and development in space. But the bad was that it, like, took the focus away from science and just, like arbitrary achievements, But still, very important accomplishment. So, yeah. All right, should I go to the next slide?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so we have Laika and Sputnik 2. And you can see Laika the dog down there in the little capsule, in this little model here. So Laika was a stray dog, right?
And I don't think that's Laika. I think that's a different dog.
Oh, it's a different one? I thought I searched up...
that's not actually Laika.
Well, no. It's just a model.
Yeah, it's a model.
Oh.
Yeah, no, it's just a model. It's like...
Oh, that's a good model. I thought that was a dog.
Yeah, no, it's not a real dog. It's like...
Yeah, I saw at a museum once, realistic models, and I was like, why is there a dog in this museum? And then I realized there's a clay model. So people can make really realistic dogs.
Yeah, so this is just a model.
Yeah, I figured it out. Also, want to point out, 128. The stream is going on 128.
Yeah, we're at the 128 seconds mark. But yeah, so Laika was...
Also, Jim McCarthy says, don't make me game.
Yep. Yeah, so Laika was a stray dog from the streets of Moscow. And then they trained this dog to actually, like, go to space in the Sputnik 2 capsule and become the first living being, or the first animal to, like, successfully orbit the Earth. And I say first animal because technically there were like space-resistant bacteria on Sputnik 1 because bacteria is just able to survive anything. So the bacteria on Sputnik 1 was technically the first living thing to make it to space. But excluding that, right, Laika was the first. So Laika didn't actually survive, which is the sad part.
Yeah.
Laika, like...
There's a really good story about her, though.
Uh-huh. I think it got too hot or something. Like, they didn't have proper cooling mechanisms. So Laika made it to orbit. And this is another thing, as I was saying earlier. So Laika made it to orbit to have the accomplishment of first living being in orbit, but then died because it didn't matter as much first living thing in orbit to survive. It was just first living thing in orbit. So that's another little like issue. But yeah, like a good pupper. That's what I say. That's how I rate.
Pup.
Yeah, good pupper. Yeah. So that's interesting. I like in BoJack Horseman when they have a reference to Laika being the first woman in space, because in this show, if you don't know BoJack Horseman, I don't even need to explain it. You get it. It was funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's Laika and Sputnik 2. Anything else for this, or should I change slides?
I think we're good.
Cool.
I think we're good. Yeah.
All right. So then we have the Vostok Program, and the Vostok Program. This is another accomplishment that went to Russia. Like, Russia was really gaining all these early accomplishments. This program ended up seeing the first human in orbit, you know? And that human was, Yuri Gagarin.
Gagarin?
Did I say it right?
The hell did you just say?
Yuri
Gagarin,
yeah.
Yuri Gagarin.
It's
Gagarin, whatever.
What?
Gagarin.
Yuri, okay.
You probably pronounce it like Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein. No, okay. Yuri, okay. He was the first man.
Maddest lad.
He was the first person to successfully, make orbits in space. Yeah, so as you can see, Russia had first man-made object in orbit, first animal in orbit, first human in orbit. So NASA and the U.S. at first was like, oh shoot, we're behind. We really got to catch up. So they were scrambling a lot of the way because the U.S.S.R. kept making these early victories. I think it was during a later Vostok program where Russia also had the first woman in space, the first woman to make orbits of the Earth, because the United States, their astronaut program was like male only. It was exclusive to men. But in the USSR, it was both men and women, which is interesting because it's like you would think the US, which is like a freer society than the USSR, would allow women to be astronauts in this period, right? But that's just one of the weird things where the USSR, in certain situations, was like more like free, but like it's weird, because they had a lot of these like very like liberal like policies, where they saw like men and women as equal in the USSR, which the US did not as much yet. Like, there were still more gender roles, whereas the USSR was like, with the modus operandi of the like communist economy is that like everyone is equal and has to share the work. So Russia also got the accomplishment of first woman in space as well. So yeah, so that's the Vostok program. So the Vostok, I think, is kind of like the equivalent of NASA's Gemini program, if you know the Gemini program. So this is human space flight.
Gemini?
What? You should.
No, it's Gemini.
You should know Gemini.
Isn't it Gemini?
Gemini.
Can you just not pronounce things?
Gemini. It's Gemini. Okay.
It's Gemini.
No, it's Taurus.
What?
Okay.
It's not Taurus. It's Taurus.
No. Okay. Listen. Okay.
Max, my man.
No. Okay. Listen. The astrological sign might be Gemini, but a lot of the people like working on it actually referred to it as Gemini. Okay.
I mean, the logo is the ash.
Okay.
The logo is the ash.
Listen, pronunciations change over like 50 years, 60 years, okay? I've watched a lot of TV shows about like the space race era because like that's what I do because I find it interesting. And they all say Gemini, okay? Okay, so I'm just...
Yeah, there's no wrong way to pronounce something.
Exactly, okay? Language, as long as it's understood by the speaker and the listener, that's all that matters. Yeah. So this Vostok program is the equivalent. Oh yeah. Also we have chat. Yeah. Missing music. Yay, progressive thinking. Yep. So it's an interesting aspect of the USSR that like in some places it was more progressive than the US, but then in other places, you know, like freedom of speech was not respected at all.
Gulags.
Yeah. So it's like, it's interesting. And it's also kind of interesting how the US, like, in response to like this nation that had all of this, like, was so regressive in so many ways that the US could also be like less free in certain facets, you know? It's like as the US, I would try and be like, hey, we're not like them. Look at how good we are, right? But anyways, so yeah, Vostok and Gemini were like equivalent programs, okay? So yeah, so the Vostok just came earlier, you know? Vostok was able to hit the marks quicker. So this is just Soviet success, okay? So I'm going to go to the next. Missing music says exactly. Yeah. Anyways, okay. So Luna program. So the Luna program involved just probes that Russia sent to the moon, or that the Soviet Union sent to the moon. So unmanned missions, they were sending space probes to study the moon for like, you know, for science, but then also obviously for possible landing sites and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is kind of part of their efforts for the moon, but we put that as a separate thing because this was just like uncrewed. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah. Also, it's interesting. Look how the Russian word for program is pretty much the same as the like British way that they say program, except with the Cyrillic letters.
Oh yeah, with the two M's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, programmy, like
Program.
like it's interesting. I like how American English compared to British English is just like a lot of words have had letters taken out of them for efficiency. And I like efficiency, so I prefer American English.
Nah, you gotta put the U in color.
No way. Oh, unforgivable.
It's the wrong. It's just wrong.
Yeah, speaking about pronouncing things incorrectly, Britain. It's aluminum.
It's actually rubbish. It's not pronounced trash. It's pronounced rubbish.
That rubbish.
Rubbish. I don't know though. Aluminium does follow the trends of all the elements.
You need to jump out a window.
Think of sodium. Think of calcium.
I require it.
Think of
cadmium.
Scandium.
Yeah.
Cadmium. Indium.
Barium.
Yeah, barium.
But there's something about
strontium.
Saying aluminium makes me want to like take a cheese grater to you.
I think if you're talking about the element, say aluminium. But if you're talking about like
aluminum foil,
then you should say.
Okay. I think that's
that's the worst possible.
No, I say that's a good compromise. That's the best we can get. It's an element, okay? Think about it.
This is why we had the revolutionary
Yeah,
Listen,
this is
okay?
why it
Because
was necessary.
lobster backs.
I'm going to
were
say a
over there
series of
saying
words.
aluminium and spelling salt.
I'm going to say a
PH.
series of words, okay? And tell me, like, which word, like, sounds out of place, okay? Sodium, strontium, calcium, aluminum. Like, it doesn't fit, okay? Aluminium. You gotta have the ium.
No, it fits. It fits.
No.
Yes, it does.
Aluminium fits better.
No, it does. No, it's just not right.
No,
You know?
this is just
It's
fact.
Just not.
If you publish your, like, study on aluminium and...
Like, what about how they say respiratory? You know how they say it?
How?
They say, like, respiratory.
No, that's stupid. Respiratory.
Yeah, they say something terrible.
Respiratory.
I don't know what it is. Someone look it up. Look up how British people
Well,
say.
look. The point is, right, if you do a study on the substance, right, however you want to say it, I'm just going to say aluminum right now, okay? If you do a study on aluminum and you call it aluminum and you spell it aluminum, then in the scientific community, when people search aluminium, which is the international consensus, they won't find your study. So if you want your study to have higher visibility, you should call it aluminium, not aluminum. That's just a fact.
Listen to this
that all
voodoo. This is
chemists
how they
know.
pronounce respiratory.
Okay.
Respiratory.
That's terrible.
That
is god-awful.
Respiratory. Plant a tree. Spare a life.
Respiratory. Just gonna be like, what's wrong with
Yeah.
your respiratory system? And then the
Or how
person's
they say capillaries.
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 Yeah.
Capillaries.
Yeah, capillaries.
That's not cool.
Are you kidding me? What is this, 4th grade? No, it's capillary.
Oh boy.
A very hungry capillary.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm glad I don't have
Anyways,
much
Britain
British
is officially
audience because
country.
they would not be pleased.
Efforts for the moon.
Right now. Yeah, efforts for the moon. Okay, and watch this.
Also, I want to point out that this slide in the last, Max and I went our separate ways to design them, and we both came up with the exact same designs.
Yeah, exactly.
Like for the Luna one, we both got the same image at the same
cool.
time,
Yep.
and we both thought of the Soviet flag up
Mhm.
at the same exact time. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, Soviet efforts for the moon. They wanted to get to the moon first. That was the point of the space race, but then they didn't. And this was a major failing point for them because essentially this was how much of our economy can we throw behind this project, right? And if you think about it, the Soviet Union should have been at an advantage because they were a more authoritarian government. So if they wanted their money behind it, they could just put it there, right? They don't have to respond to their citizens as much as in the U.S., where if you throw all your money behind a space program and the people don't want it, then they don't vote for you again, right? So
Yeah.
The Soviet Union was already starting with an advantage, but when the U.S. went and beat them to that moon landing, then it just kind of showed weakness in their economy, and it showed weakness in them as a nation. And so that's what leads into the eventual decline of the Soviet Union. So, yeah. So that's their efforts for the moon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We beat them.
Yep.
Mhm.
We beat them.
Mm.
Anyway.
But didn't we also use their help or their technology to some extent in determining whether or not we could actually pull off the moon landing? Or was it entirely the U.S.?
I think we did it. I think we did it pretty independently.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Definitely there's, I wouldn't say collaboration, but a lot of the data ended up being shared because there were spies on both sides. So
That's true.
Yeah.
at first, one of the things that they were concerned about with the moon landing, right, was that is the moon even solid?
There.
right? Like, no,
Is
of
the
like
moon real?
Right. So the moon is covered in all this regolith, right? But so that's like dust, sand, right? Regolith. And right underneath the regolith is solid rock, so you're able to stand on it. But what if it was just regolith the whole way through? Like they had no way of knowing. And if it was regolith the whole way through, then they could have just kind of like sunk like in quicksand, you know? Um, and that would make for an interesting moon landing. Like that wouldn't be good. So the U.S. had to make sure that wasn't going to happen first, like very rudimentary things like that. So yeah, data was probably shared, like unwillingly shared, you know. Yeah, but yeah, so that's the efforts for the moon. They tried, and they did not succeed. And a lot of the one thing that the space race is accredited with is actually somewhat draining the Soviet economy. We'll get into this later in the decline section, but a lot of the like success against the Soviet Union just came from like draining them until they couldn't like maintain themselves anymore. So kind of like a war of attrition in a sense, but it wasn't all out war. It was the Cold War. So it was essentially like we're going to like invest in these programs that you are going to have to call our bets for, otherwise you'll seem weak. And when you like try to match us, you end up draining your economy. So that's what the moon landing did to the Soviet Union. So yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll go to the next slide. So here we have the Apollo-Soyuz mission, where this didn't actually go to the moon. It was just like a rendezvous. Like they docked the Apollo like stage to a Soyuz craft, which is a Russian vehicle that we still use today. Actually, it's actually just getting phased out. Like as SpaceX like becomes a contractor with NASA. But yeah, Soyuz space capsule, right? So they rendezvoused and they had a little joint mission to show like, okay, like peace, right? Like this is over. So this was kind of the official end to the space race because it was collaborative. And it also signified like the end of the Apollo program. So this is like a really definitive end because it's like, all right, no more competition, no need to fund the Apollo program anymore, stuff like that. Yeah. It's interesting. Something you never think about, but it's true, is that Richard Nixon was the president for the moon landing and for the Apollo like program on the moon. Isn't that weird?
It's a little disturbed.
Like you always associate the moon landing with Kennedy because, you know, he was the one that like spurred the nation to do it, but he had died by the time that it actually came to fruition. But his like challenge, you know, of to get to the moon by the end of the decade, they got in, you know, like by a hairstring, right? Like they got it in like they only had 6 months left, like in 1969, and then it would have been the 70s, and then it would have been unsuccessful. But yeah, so it's pretty interesting.
I imagine the moon landing is something that a lot of older people definitely remember. And I bet if you asked your grandparents, they could easily tell you like exactly what they were doing during the moon landing or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like just before my parents' times. Like my mom was born like a month after the moon landing. So it's like interesting. It's interesting how long ago it was. It was over 50 years ago now.
Yeah, and it's also interesting like how arguably in the time of the space race there was more progression than in the past 50 years since the landing.
Yeah, it just shows you what competition can do. It's like, yeah. So it's like I half like want like, yay, let's try and get another competitive force, but at the same time,
let's start another Cold War.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's the last thing that the government
exactly
spend money on now.
Exactly. At the same time, right? You don't want like the U.S.S.R. You don't want another power like that to be a major competitive force with your country. So it's like half and half.
Yeah, let's just have a space race with like Venice or something that we know can't beat us.
That we know can't beat us. Yeah, just challenge every nation to a space race. Just like, hey, Britain, hey, France, hey, like, you know, like, hey, South Africa, just any nation, just
and
like
Kazakhstan.
Yeah, try and beat us, and then they're like, we can't win.
It's like we lose, they upset us. They just throw rocks into space and it works.
Hey, Vietnam. Oh.
Uh-oh.
Yep.
Uh-oh.
Doo-doo.
Yep.
Now we go into the decline.
Yeah.
Yes.
Give us that cue.
Yep. So that's the decline. So that's the decline sound effect. So the Soviet Union was not doing well after the space race, after Stalin. They were not able, like, they were becoming weaker. And the leaders that we're going to talk about...
A few people had to get them.
Yeah. Yeah, the leaders we're going to talk about actually helped to weaken the U.S.S.R. So, yeah. Should I go to the first?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go to the first one. Okay.
We also have chat.
Oh, we do. Okay. I also... Yep. Here we go.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyways,
there he is, the man.
Yep. All right. So, okay. So we have Missing Music says respiratory, guys. The new recycling. Yeah, sparatry, resparatry. Interesting. And then, what kind of cheese is the moon made of?
Green cheese.
Okay. Anyways, so
it's
Ronald
made of
Reagan.
Green cheese.
Ronald Reagan.
Green.
It's green cheese.
I'm just brushing right past that. Okay.
Google it. It's green cheese.
I thought you said cream cheese, and I was like,
it's green cheese.
Okay, so Ronald Reagan, he was the president of the U.S. for 8 years. He's the symbol of the 80s, if you think about it, because he was president from 1981.
9 out of 10.
Yeah, it was 1981 to 1989, and he was like very tough on the Soviet Union. Like all presidents were like essentially because the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in conflict during this period, but Ronald Reagan especially was against the Soviet Union. So he was a Republican, conservative. So that especially like made him like go against the U.S.S.R. like fundamentally, just like on like ideology. He called it an evil empire in like a 1983 speech. So like he was very anti like Soviet Union, whereas other like previous presidents, I think Jimmy Carter was right before him, was like considered a little weaker, like was willing to like cooperate like and be like diplomatic and be like, okay, let's like try and solve things peacefully. But Ronald Reagan's like, no way, we're gonna beat you. Like we're better. So that's interesting. Yeah, Ronald Reagan. He also was the one who originated the "Make America Great Again" phrase. Like Trump took that from Reagan.
Reagan went to any lengths pretty much to beat the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he was like...
So with the nuclear conflict, he sort of wanted to end mutual assured destruction, which is basically like if one person sends a nuke at a country, the other country will nuke them back, and that's what prevents nukes from being used. And he wanted to implement this thing called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is like some of the craziest stuff that you've ever seen.
Yeah, it's
if
also
you
been
look at the
referred
ad
to.
for it.
It's also
like lasers and particle beams that can take out nukes.
It's also been referred to as like the Star Wars program, right?
Yeah,
crazy like lasers, like satellites in space, like totally like Star Wars stuff. I mean,
but we didn't even need it because by the time like it came around, the Union was already pretty much gone, or at least it had ended.
Yeah, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, just 2 years after Reagan's presidency ended. So they were like already way on the way out by the time that this could have been like initiated. So it wasn't like necessary by the time they could have done it. So, but yeah, Reagan proposed this. He was like, yeah, we're gonna like put satellites in space to defend against nukes. And pretty much he kind of like there was an increase in military spending during Reagan's presidency, and what this did was this encouraged the Soviet Union to increase military spending, which again just drained their financial resources because they could not afford to fund their military that much. But they did because with the Cold War, they just had to match the U.S. like just in case war actually occurred, which is really interesting. So the whole like conflict during the Cold War is pretty much both sides just trying to be equally ready like for battle against each other, but then never actually going and fighting each other.
Except for the proxy wars, where they would basically use their resources to back certain countries. Yeah. And that's sort of where you see their the fighting actually playing out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, in general, Ronald Reagan, I mean, he also like led to success like in the American economy. So the American economy was doing well, which contrasted to the Soviet economy, which was not doing well. It was just continuing to do poorly. So with the improved American economy, we were able to like spend more on different programs, and the U.S.S.R. tried to match that, and that like contributed to their failure. So yeah, so Ronald Reagan was I would say pretty important in actually causing the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah, so that's all I have to say there.
Yep.
Cool. All right. So our next person is Margaret Thatcher. Who's also referred to
Margaret Thatcher.
Okay. Also referred to as the
Margaret.
Is he gonna say
no Thatcher?
Is he gonna say
cuts out?
Oh, anyways. Margaret Thatcher. Oh god.
Needs to speak to the manager. Haircut.
Okay, Margaret Thatcher was the leader of England during the 1980s.
Yeah, the Prime Minister.
Yeah, the Prime Minister.
I think.
Yeah, Prime Minister. And she was also very tough on the Soviets. So, like, both Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, like, together providing this sort of, like, united front against the Soviets was just especially bad for them because they were like, oh, geez, we cannot handle this, all this pressure. So, yeah, Margaret Thatcher pretty much, like, had a similar effect to Reagan, you know, like, she bolstered Reagan's claims because if the United Kingdom, if they had, like, a leader that was willing to be, like, more cooperative with Russia, like, more, like, willing to, like, be diplomatic instead of, like, we're gonna win, then that would have, like, weakened Reagan's front against the Soviet Union. So it was important that Margaret Thatcher was also there as leader of England, which is also a major power, to, like, have this united front against the Soviet Union. And yeah, she also helped in causing its collapse. So yeah.
And then the last person we have is probably the dude that's trying to prevent the collapse, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, Mikhail Gorbachev. It's interesting because he was trying to prevent the collapse, obviously. He was the leader of the Soviet Union. But he was also offered the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for, like, all this de-escalation and compromise that he actually, like, did with the U.S. and the U.K. So instead of having a headstrong leader, like instead of like if it were another like Stalin type, like another personality that's like we're the best, like we're gonna win this, Mikhail Gorbachev actually acknowledged like yeah things aren't going too well for us. I'm gonna like help tamper things down without like just completely like letting my country down, you know. So so that's what he did. So he was important in the decline because he kind of allowed it to happen, but like kept it controlled in a way so that it wouldn't be like totally humiliating and horrible for Russia. So yeah, so he was an interesting leader. Yeah.
Yeah, if it hadn't been for Gorbachev, I think the transition from the USSR into Russia and all of its like satellite states and territories being released would not have gone very smoothly.
It would have,
and you could have seen like revolts in a lot of those areas. So he did a very good job of recognizing that the Union was over.
Yeah. So that's why he was offered, you know, Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. But yeah. So anyway, so next slide, we've got Chernobyl.
Yeah, an event where he was in charge that kind of showed how incompetent the Soviet Union was Chernobyl, which was the failure of one of their nuclear plants.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Chernobyl incident, 1986, right?
Yeah.
Basically, the Chernobyl nuclear plant, a lot of people, like, looking back on it, they consider it a rush job. So the Soviet Union, it was, like, desperate, so they wanted to produce this power plant, and they rushed the construction of it. And because of that rushed construction, it actually allowed this power failure to occur. And it's interesting because Chernobyl is an event that's often used to discredit nuclear power, but in reality, it really should just be used to discredit irresponsible nuclear power, because if they had followed all the correct procedures, then like things wouldn't have gone wrong, right? But it's the fact that they like did not take all the safety precautions that resulted in this tragedy. And it's interesting because it also like it gives nuclear power a bad rap, which compared to like fossil fuels, nuclear power is actually a lot better. But a lot of people now have like they are in strong opposition to nuclear power, which is interesting because it's like it's kind of like you don't see the effects of fossil fuels, right? Like it's more indirect. Whereas when a nuclear power plant has like a meltdown, it's very obvious, you know, like there's all this, you know, all radiation sickness. The thing like explodes like catastrophically. But with fossil fuel use, I mean, arguably like all the droughts it causes and the like extreme weather events probably like they kill many more people than simple nuclear power does. So it's interesting.
Yeah, but it's less direct.
Yeah, exactly. It's less direct.
We're less afraid of it.
Exactly. It's the whole thing with how people. There are many people who are afraid to fly in an airplane, right? But it's much more dangerous to drive in a car. So they're like, I don't want to fly in an airplane. It seems too dangerous. When they drive their car to work every day, and they're much more likely to die just from that commute than on a plane ride. So, and I'm talking passenger jets, like small planes can actually be dangerous, but that's basically what Chernobyl was. So yeah, it caused this like hysteria, kind of like phobia, irrational fear of nuclear power. So yeah, it was just irresponsible, and it just showed how bad the Soviet Union was at managing like their facilities, and again it speaks like of their economic decline. And it's just like I think weren't they trying to like cover it up in certain ways, like they're trying to play it down.
It's not that they necessarily tried to cover it up, it's just they didn't want to accept what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to see more about that, there's a really good HBO documentary.
Mm.
Yeah. In the documentary, doesn't it say that like the U.S. had, or is that?
Wait, what'd you say? Cut out.
Oh, sorry. In that documentary, doesn't it try and like cast it as the U.S. had something to do?
Not as far as I remember. I don't think the U.S.
Yeah, in real life, the U.S. didn't have it.
Mm.
But I remember there was one interpretation of it.
I
forget if it was
possible that people, that some people in the USSR like blame the U.S. or something.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what this piece.
But the meltdown itself, what happened was the person in charge of the plant like did not want to acknowledge that something messed up, and he was running a diagnostic to try to improve the plant's efficiency, and the diagnostic basically caused this terrible reaction that eventually led to the meltdown. But it could have been prevented, or like not necessarily stopped entirely, but the effects could have been completely reduced if they had just acknowledged that something malfunctioned. But they didn't really have the attitude at the time that would allow mistakes. So it was another failure of communism. And a lot of people, like you said, credit Chernobyl as being a reason why we shouldn't use nuclear power. But no one really talks about successful implications of nuclear power, like where nuclear power accounts for like more than 50% of all of the power generated, and there are 58 reactors that have, for the most part, not had any terrible meltdowns.
Yeah, France definitely, and like their carbon emissions in France are way down because of that. So so it's interesting, like a lot of nuclear paranoia, and well, it's also, I would say, partially stems from the concern that what like the materials you use to build a nuclear power plant could also like secretly be used to create nuclear bombs, and that is true. You can't really create a bomb of that capacity just like with fossil fuels. Like you can't secretly use it to do something much worse. So I do understand that criticism.
You also need the facilities to launch the missiles, even if you could make one. So
it just means that essentially the thing with nuclear power is, as long as it's being handled by like a stable democratic government, and it's like the process is transparent, right? So like people can see, like the media can report on it. Like as long as it's done above board and proper like that, then nuclear power really isn't something to be afraid of. However, if it is done by like corrupt governments, unstable governments, or is done like as a rush job, it's just not going to end well. So yeah, that's the lesson. Practice nuclear safety, kids. If you ever experience the opportunity of encountering nuclear material, practice nuclear safety.
All right, let's go on to the next slide.
Next slide. Economic problems, not stonks.
This one's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, we've been talking about this, but I'll just give you a brief summary of like what we've been saying already. The economic problems have factored into each of the aspects we've been talking about with the decline so far. So just remember, it's like the U.S. has been forcing them into these situations where they have to spend a lot of money on things, and they're already doing poorly, so they can't spend money on these things. But when they do, it just makes things like go even worse. These economic problems end up in severe failures, such as that at Chernobyl. It also causes, people to be poor, and people tend not to be as happy when they're poor. Yeah, it's interesting. People always say money doesn't buy happiness, but then why do so many revolutions occur when the people are impoverished? Hmm. Right? Like they always say money doesn't buy happiness, but then revolutions always occur when people are unhappy due to a lack of money.
I think money doesn't buy happiness, but money buys like basic living.
Yeah, I know. I'm just joking here, but
there is some correlation. It's pretty hard to be happy if you have nothing.
Right, like when everyone's like rich or at least like middle class, when everyone's doing well, things stay stable. But when everyone's super poor, it causes like all these like revolutions and upheaval. So, yeah. So it's funny. That's what you can say. If someone ever tells you like, "Hey, money doesn't buy happiness," you can say like, "Tell that to like, the peasants in Russia during the Russian Revolution, right? Like that's the whole reason like they went to like overthrow the Tsar." But yeah, so basically economic problems really speak of decline. Like, I mean, like looping it all around, like a Marxist view of like history is, about class struggle and how like economics affect like the rise and fall of nations. So that's really what's happening here. The poor economics of the U.S.S.R. ends up leading to its failure. So, yeah. All right. So next slide. So this is like near the end of the 80s. Moscow, the capital of the U.S.S.R., begins to lose control of its and these aren't of its states. These aren't like proxy states. These aren't satellite states. These are actual these were part of the Soviet Union. So these were the member states. So like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, all these nations, they were like part of the territory of the USSR. And by the end of the 80s, Moscow begins to lose control over these areas. They begin to revolt and they want to separate from the USSR. And yeah, so they lose control of the Baltics and the Caucasus. So, yeah. So this is this gets into collapse now.
Yeah.
So should I move on? Collapse? Yeah. Okay, collapse. Oh shit, wait. Okay, wait. There we go. I can use that sound effect on my own performance of that sound effect. I didn't have the audio on at first. Okay. But yeah, collapse. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So, yeah, so let's talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. So, that there is the Berlin Wall falling.
Yep. Yeah. Should I go to the next slide for the Berlin Wall?
We're gonna talk about that a lot. Okay. Next slide as well. It was a wall through Berlin, made West Berlin and East Berlin, and it went down in 1991. It effectively went down in 89 because that's when they allowed people from West Germany to East Germany and vice versa.
Yeah, but it physically went down.
Get shot if you tried.
Yeah. Yeah, so they stopped guarding it, but it physically went down in 1991.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a big moment because there was lots of contention about that wall being. And I just want to shout out the guy in this picture that blinked during one of the most historic pictures of the century. So,
I really like the guy in the uniform in the bottom left who's just like, oh no.
He's just like, I didn't know the wall was coming down today. It's like, I should have.
There's one dude that's bench pressing, or he's like holding it up.
Yep.
Yeah, he's actually Clark Kent. He's just
exactly. Anyways, yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the next slide. Okay, so Berlin Wall. Yeah, I mean we've pretty much just said it with the.
Yeah. But it was a pretty controversial wall. Now it's just like graffitied.
Yeah, not only was it like the metaphorical wall between the West and the Eastern culture, like it literally separated them. So it kind of
it was very significant.
It kind of brought
it was a symbol
significance in two ways.
But yes, the Berlin
Wall. Now all of the land that the Soviet Union had previously controlled became like independent nations, which in some cases benefited nations, but in other cases did not. Because it's like once you get economic independence from something that you have either relied on or been exploited by, it's very hard to recover and become functioning.
In the case of Germany, the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed for Germany to unify again, like to become one nation. The Berlin Wall is really interesting because people started to flee East Germany via like West Berlin because they were able to get into that half of the city, which was, controlled by like American, French, and British, and they were able to escape the repressive laws that came with Soviet Russia and all their satellite states. So since so many people were fleeing from East Germany into West Berlin, they had to put up this wall to keep people in East Germany because they didn't want their people to flee because it reflected poorly on them. That's something I think in one of Reagan's speeches, he says, like, we don't need a wall to keep our people in, right? Like, the U.S.S.R. needed the Berlin Wall to keep their people from leaving the country, which just reflects how poorly they were doing because, like, if your people don't want to stay in your nation and they're actually, like, trying to leave and you need to prevent them from leaving, that just shows that you're unsuccessful. Like, that's with North Korea too right now. Like, they have to prevent people from leaving because people want to leave. So that just it just shows that like the government isn't being successful, right? So once the Berlin Wall fell, it allowed like freedom of motion once again between the two halves of Germany, which that's pretty significant. Because for 40 years it was just a nation divided in two, which is just crazy. So that's the Berlin Wall. Anything else?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go to the next slide. Okay, so now we have post-Soviet states, and there were 15 of them. So there's Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was divided into all of these smaller states. And smaller is relative, of course, because Russia is still massive. It's just crazy. The U.S.S.R. was huge, and it was carved into 15 states, and one of those states is still massive. I mean, Kazakhstan, number 6, is also fairly massive as a state. So it's just crazy how large of a nation it was, right? But so now that's your map. That's your modern-day Russia, your modern-day Ukraine. You have your Eastern Europe, you have your like Asian parts, you have the Caucasus as well. So this is where we get our familiar map of these places, the map we see today. So it's funny, I think in one of my classrooms, like in middle school, they had a really old globe, like it was obviously from before 1990, because the USSR was still one nation on the globe.
Oh my God.
It was in middle school, I think. I'm forgetting which classroom. But I remember joking about it with one of my friends. I'm like, what? This is such an old map. It still thinks the USSR is one nation. It was so funny. Like, to see an old globe like that. Like, it's understandable if a globe, say, like, doesn't include South Sudan. It just means that the globe is from before 2011, right? So, like, 10-year-old globe won't have South Sudan on it. but the USSR, that's like 30 years ago. So that was interesting. Yeah. So that's what happened to Russia. That's what happened to the Soviet Union. So should I go to the next slide for the modern day influence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we have our music
The
again.
legacy.
Yeah. Here we go.
Tonight.
Da, 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 da.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's look at modern day Russia.
Yeah, today it's like we said at the start of the stream, less powerful than it was in its U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's generally probably a good thing because people were suffering in the U.S.S.R. All those dead because of Stalin, the poor leadership of original Russia, and all of that I think contributed to how Russia is the way it is today.
Yeah.
Right now, Russia is gearing up to be one of America's biggest threats. And if they keep expanding into Ukraine, then we might be prompted to take action in other countries. And I think Russia is interesting for the same reason I started, because it's been jumping in and out of the global superpower. And it's interesting to see a country with so be sometimes thrown by its own people. It's no outside influence ever made Russia fall out of that superpower position. It was always or some event that held them back, and it's always themselves holding themselves back historically. So what Putin might be doing is he's trying to make sure that doesn't happen again, which is why he's trying to bolster it. Right now they have very good relations with China, another global superpower, so that's definitely helping.
But they're also in trouble as of recently because of their oil economy, which is getting destroyed by the Middle East. So it will also be interesting how that plays out. And the USSR had pretty much control of their region to the degree that they could exist entirely in the Middle East. And the only person that would challenge them would be America. But today, the Middle East is an area that no single nation can seem to get control of. Yeah. So I don't think that modern Russia will be able to do that. And the biggest connection between the USSR and modern Russia that I see is Putin, censorship of media and how he controls journalists. That can be directly compared to the USSR's media restriction.
Yeah, that's definitely an important part of its legacy. Vladimir Putin is technically the president of Russia, but how long has he been the president? It's been for such a long time. When they technically vote for president, but it's not really a fair vote. It's just going to be Putin every time. And so, yeah, it's very interesting because Russia, while it is a freer nation for its people than it was during the era of the Soviet Union, it is still a fairly repressive country.
Yes.
For example, LGBT issues, homosexuality, I think, is illegal in.
It's so actually Russia. I just because I was going to bring that up. It's not illegal to be gay. I think you can even have gay marriage.
Oh, really?
In Russia, but the thing is that if you are a homosexual, you are not given the same legal protections as a regular citizen. Okay. And especially if you're in a gay marriage, you do not get insurance and you don't get any government protection. So it's effectively illegal, because without it, And I believe it's the same way.
In which country? Sorry, what did you say? You cut out a bit.
China. I think it's the same way in China. Sorry.
Yeah, China. It's interesting. A lot of like big American movies have had to like censor aspects of their films for their releases in China because they want to capitalize on that market.
Yeah.
Like I think the movie about Queen, like they took out a few scenes just so that they could sell it in China, because China, of course, is such an economic bloc, right? You'd be a fool like not to sell your stuff in Russia, or sorry, China. But yeah, so they had to censor that. So definitely, it is. Yeah, Russia is still not as free as America is. So the legacy of the USSR still like looms over the country.
Yeah.
It still
it is a global superpower, though. It has gotten its seat back, and especially if you look at the UN, because the reason that we can't really take any action to Russia or to China is because they are also on the UN, and they're like the big boys on the UN. Yeah. So if America wants to make a decision that goes against what Russia and China want, it's not happening.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And vice versa as well.
It's interesting.
If Russia and China want to move forward with something.
Yeah.
The U.S. and probably like Britain or France or even Germany will counter that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
So it's like
with the UN.
It's a Mexican standoff.
Yeah, exactly. With the
with the Russian president, you're not supposed to be able to for more than 2 terms consecutively. And the term used to be 4 years, but of course someone extended it to 6 years. So now Putin has served 4 consecutive terms of 6 years, which is like way too long in my opinion for any elected official.
So wait,
and he's actually
since 2000.
Dang, that's
he
20 years,
has actually, believe it or not, like just 5 days ago, he's been talking to the Russian parliament, to the Kremlin, and all those guys, and he is trying to make a law that will let him be president for life.
Wow, yeah, so that's bad, because that's pretty much, that's like a Stalinist lead. Like that's
exactly, he's trying to return back to the USSR.
Yeah,
and that's not good. Not even for the citizens.
That's good if it's a Beatles song, though.
Very true. Back in the USSR.
Yeah.
Good song.
Well, it's interesting with the UN, because the 5 most important nations in the UN are the U.S., Britain, France, China, and Russia. And that's not just a matter of opinion. Like, within the framework of the UN, those 5 countries are, like, given more power than all the other countries.
Exactly.
They're, like, when it comes to determining what nations, like, count as a member state, you need, like, I think it's 50% of the General Assembly, plus you need all 5 of those powers to agree. So all 5 of these powers essentially have like veto privileges, right? So they're able to just say, not a country. Like if you consider Palestine, like over 50% of the assembly has recognized it as a nation, but the U.S. does not because of, our ties to Israel and like our support of Israel. So because of the U.S.'s like veto privileges, like Palestine is not an official member of the UN. So Russia and China have that power as well, which is interesting. Yeah. So yeah, that's the legacy today. Anything else on this?
I think we can move on to the final.
All right. Final thoughts. Wow. So this was a long one, but I think that was warranted, because we have all probably been very bored in our respective houses. So I hope that we brought you some entertainment and some edutainment, if you've heard that word. Some
I so wish I didn't.
Yeah, I did not. You did not need to hear that.
Yep, me too. I forced you guys to hear that word. I know. I usually do not like when they mix two words together. I hate that. So I just...
No way, Langria.
Right? I just thought it would be hilarious because... yeah, because I usually find it a little cringy when people like mix two words together. But anyways, yeah, I hope we've provided you with some interesting information and with some good times during, this difficult period of time where we have to practice social distancing and stay in our houses.
I wonder what Russia's doing in response.
Yeah.
Let me see.
Yeah.
They're just shooting.
Yeah, wait. Let's just see their coronavirus cases.
Yeah. Well, North Korea has executed. I think they had a coronavirus case, right? And didn't they just kill the person?
Yeah, they just killed the person.
Yeah.
Nice.
63.
It's all that land in between places.
Yeah.
It's not going to spread
low
from
density.
one place to another.
Also, maybe it didn't develop cold resistance too.
As of today,
wow.
Total number of infections is 6. Not that high.
And it has ran over 104,000 tests, which I think is probably higher than the U.S. on this.
Yeah.
I don't know. They might actually have been more prepared than the U.S.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
To put that into perspective, I'm trying to find how many cases there have been in the U.S. Odd.
Yeah, because in January 30th, the Russian government suspended all business trips to China. And then
Italy is at 25,000, so that's big. But anyways, going back to the topic, U.S.S.R, I think it has one of the richest history of any country, which is surprising because, yes, it is an old world country, but also, what we covered was the 1917 to 1991. And just in that period of time, the history was so rich, and it's shifted economically, globally, their power on a global scale. Their population has shifted so much, their industries have shifted so much, the way their government runs has shifted so much, and for it to be a global superpower today, shows how adaptive Russia can be. And I think it's also going into how one of the reasons why I like America, because a lot of it is we find success through our people and through our work ethic, because some countries have lots of natural resources and they can use that for agriculture and build a country off of that. But largely in America, and yes, we do have ties with China and all of that, but we built a society pretty much ourselves, and it's the people, and we can adapt through a lot of stuff, even the coronavirus stuff. At least where we live, Zach and I are effectively quarantined at our houses. We can go outside, but the first selectman came out yesterday in our state and was don't go outside, basically. Our beach is closed, all that is closed, and we're not doing too poorly, and as a country, yes, the stock market has been fluctuating, but as a country, we're not devastated, and I think Russia is kind of the same, because a lot of Russia is just snow, it's just Arctic stuff. And the other part of it isn't really that rich in resources. That's why they need their oil from Saudi Arabia. That's why they need stuff from China. That's why they need minerals from Africa, right? Just like the U.S. does. And it's the people that are able to adapt and respond to different situations, which is why I do have respect for Russia. Because they've been through a lot. They've had terrible leaders, and they've been able to come back. Some might argue that the current leader of Russia is terrible, just like some would argue that the current leader of America is terrible. America and Russia are similar in so many ways that it's like strange to think that they would be so opposed to each other. In an ideal world, Russia and America would be like partners with each other, and
like Apollo-Soyuz.
Especially like you see during the space race, how much scientific potential there was there, and all of the exploration and the development that came from that. If we can work with Russia, like America and Russia will just like be in a symbiotic relationship and just constantly boost each other. Because the thing is, like, America has kind of cornered the market in some industries. Like, we have Hollywood and we have stuff like that. And that's kind of what Russia needs. It needs to diversify itself a little bit more. It is diverse on a global scale, but if tough times come, they might be like undercut, which is why the oil crisis is pretty big. But again, if they were able to work together, and especially if Russia stopped working with China, because China is a terrible, terrible country when you look at a humanitarian perspective, it's like if Russia stops working with them, that stops China from getting any more ahead. And Russia and America team up, and they could honestly make some pretty big change.
Yeah.
You know?
Along those lines, if you were born in like 1900 or even 1910 and you lived through the entire you would have seen some pretty like crazy development.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because you would go from using horses to cars to airplanes.
Yeah.
To the space race. And I mean, I doubt that a lot of people there originally are still alive today. There might be.
Oh yeah, my great grandma was born in 1926, I believe. Yeah, she's still alive. So
I doubt that there are any people, or that there are a lot of people that have actually witnessed the Russian Revolution and are still today. But it's just like the past 100 years have really, their development has been shown throughout the USSR. And what happens in the future, we can use what happened to the USSR to sort of predict in some scenarios.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's such a rich history, and like as you said, totally, it's such a rich history, and we weren't even able to like cover all of it. Like if you think of like Cuban Missile Crisis, a lot of the proxy wars,
or Afghanistan, any of that,
we weren't able to talk about that, and we still like went over the length of the average GravityMax live stream. So if you are interested, definitely, do some research yourself. Look at those things. Always fascinating. I always like to get on a research kick of something. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. So yeah, hopefully this live stream inspires you to do that every once in a while. But yeah, so I would like to thank the two of you for being here today. Zach, thank you for being a great guest. Zach, thank you for being a great Zach. And bringing your knowledge to this live stream about the history of the USSR. And Sebastian, thank you as always for being my co-host.
I legally cannot leave.
Yeah, I've got a contract. We signed a contract. Yeah. Yeah, and thank you, audience, for being here. Hopefully you come again next week. And yeah, so that's it. Anything else to say, or should I end the live stream?
I think we're good.
Das Vidanya. I think that's how you say it. I have Russian friends be disappointed in me if that's wrong.
All right.
But
well,
thank you for watching.
Yeah.
And hope you guys learned something.
Yep. Thank you guys, and see you next week.